Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. Westeros has ended before many times. It has burned, drowned, broken, and been built again on top of its own ruin by people who believed they were the first. On an island in the middle of a great lake stands a tree with a human face carved into pale wood. Its eyes have been weeping red sap for 10,000 years. The tree was old before the first king was crowned, the first war was fought, and all before the great wall in the north ever rose. It has watched every conqueror arrive certain he would be the last, and it has watched every one of them fall. This is a land where history does not stay remembered. It repeats. The children of the forest came first and were broken.
The first men came after and were broken in their turn. Then the Andals, the Rhoynar, the dragon lords of old Valyria, wave after wave, each certain the world had begun with them. The children had seers who could look back through time and see all that had ever been. Look back with them now, past the first men, past every name we know, to the years when the children still ruled the forest alone. The first people to walk Westeros were not men, and they were not large. The men who came later called them the children of the forest, though they were not children at all. They were a people grown and ancient when the first human foot touched the continent. The name was a measure of size, not age, to a tall, bronze-armed warrior from across the sea.
They looked small and slight and strange, with great golden eyes and skin the color of the earth and the bark, so he called them children the way a giant might. They were dark and beautiful in a way that unsettled men, with hands that had too few fingers. They wore no metal and forged no swords. What weapons they carried were made of stone and wood and woven grass, bows of weirwood, blades of obsidian, the black glass spat up by the fire mountains. They dressed in leaves and bark and the skins of animals. They did not build cities. They did not raise stone keeps or dig deep mines or cut the forest down. They lived inside the woods, not against them, and the woods in that age covered everything. A squirrel could have traveled from the northern coast to the southern shore without once touching the ground, leaping from branch to branch the whole width of the continent. Under that endless green canopy, the children made their homes in the hollows of trees, in cran hidden in the bogs, in caves beneath the hills. They were few, and the land was vast, and they left almost no mark on it that a man would recognize as a mark. The first thing worth understanding about them is that they were a people who did not conquer the place they lived in. They shaped it, but gently, the way water shapes a stone over 1,000 years, rather than the way a hammer shapes it in an afternoon. Their power was real, and it was strange. The children had magic of a kind that men would never fully possess or understand. The wisest among them were called green seers, and the songs say, a green seer could see through the eyes of animals, could look out from a bird, or a wolf, or a fish, could send his sight roaming far from his own body. The greatest of them, men later claimed, could see through time itself, backward into the past, and forward into things not yet come. Whether any of that was true in the way men meant it, no one can prove. But the men who lived alongside the children believed it utterly, and they feared it. The heart of that power was the weirwood. These were the great white trees with blood-red leaves and bark pale as bone, and they grew across all of Westeros in that age. The children carved faces into them, long, solemn faces with deep eyes that wept red sap. Those carved trees were their temples and their memory, and in some way no man ever explained, their books. The children believed that the trees remembered, that a green seer bound into a weirwood did not truly die, but lived on inside the wood, watching through the carved eyes, holding the memory of everything the tree had seen. 10,000 years of watching, gathered in the roots and the white wood and the red leaves. Once a year, the songs say, the children gathered to hold their most sacred rites in the heart of a great wood where 1,000 carved faces wept together. They sang the songs of the earth, the music that gave them their other name. Men called them the children of the forest, but the children called themselves something closer to those who sing the song of the earth.
It was a name about belonging to a place, not ruling it. They were not alone in that empty world. In the cold lands of the far north, beyond where men would one day raise their wall, there walked the giants. They were exactly what the name promised. Huge and shaggy and terrible in their strength, 12 feet tall and more, riding mammoths through the snow, hairy from head to foot, more like great beasts than like men in the eyes of those who saw them. They had no kings and built no halls. They lived rough and simple in the worst cold the continent could offer, and they kept apart. And they too were a people of the land rather than its masters. For a span of years that no one can honestly count, the maesters say 12,000 years, some say less. All of them are guessing. This was the whole of Westeros. The children in their forests, with their carved trees and their green magic, the giants in the snow, the beasts of the wood and the wild, and a few other things the old songs whisper of that may never have lived at all. No castles, no crowns, no iron, no men. A world that turned through its long seasons under a quiet that had never once been broken by a sock, human voice. It is easy looking back to make this age into a paradise, and that is a mistake. The children were not gentle by nature. Their magic could be turned to dark ends, and the wars that came would prove it. The giants were dangerous, and the wild was cruel, and life in the deep woods was hard. This was not a golden time without suffering, but it was a world that ran by one rule, that every age afterward would break. The people who lived in Westeros in this first long age did not believe the land belonged to them. They believed they belonged to the land. That is the whole difference, and the whole tragedy waiting on the other side of it. Everything that comes after this, every king, every wall, every burned castle, and broken house, and song of conquest, grows out of a single idea that the children never had. The idea that a place can be owned, that you can put a name and a banner on a stretch of forest, or coast, or mountain, and call it yours, and pass it to your sons, and kill the men who say otherwise. The children shaped Westeros without conquering it. They left their faces in the trees and their songs in the air, and almost nothing else. No roads, no ruins, no thrones to fight over. And because they took so little, and held it so lightly, they had no defenses ready when something arrived that took everything and held it with both hands. Far across the narrow sea, in lands the children had never seen and could not imagine, a different kind of people had already learned to work bronze, to ride horses, to fell trees and break ground and raise walls. They had learned to want things and to take them. They were coming, though no green seer's far sight seems to have warned the children in time. The quiet of the Dawn Age was about to end, and the carved faces in the weirwoods, which had watched over an empty and peaceful continent for longer than anyone could measure, were about to watch the first men set foot on the shore and begin almost at once to cut the trees down. They came across a bridge of land. In that age, the continent of Westeros was joined to the eastern lands by a long arm of dry ground, a strip of hills and rock that reached out across the water like a finger pointing east. The maesters placed this somewhere near 12,000 years ago, though, as with everything in those deep ages, the number is a guess dressed up as a fact. What matters is not the year. What matters is what these people carried with them, because they brought into Westeros things the continent had never held before. They brought bronze. They had learned to dig copper and tin from the earth, and melt them together, and pour them into shapes, axes, and spears, and long leaf-bladed swords that held an edge no obsidian blade could match. They brought horses broad and strong, and they rode them in a land where nothing had ever been ridden. They brought leather, and they brought great round shields, and they came in numbers the children had never had to imagine. The men who later wrote the histories called them simply the first men, because they were the first of humankind to live in Westeros. To the children who had no humans at all in their world until that morning, they must have seemed less like a people than like a flood, and the first thing the first men did, almost everywhere they settled, was cut down the trees. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the way these men lived. They cleared the forest to make fields and pastures. They felled timber to build halls and palisades, and the bones of their boats. They broke the endless green canopy open to let the sun fall on planted ground. To a farmer with a bronze axe, a great tree was wood, and nothing more, a thing to be taken down, so that something useful could grow in its place. But the trees they cut were not only trees. Among the oaks and pines stood the weirwoods, the white trees with the carved and weeping faces, and to the children those faces were sacred beyond all telling. They were temples. They were the memory of the dead. They were the very eyes through which the children believed their green seers still watched the world. And the first men, knowing none of this and caring less, put their axes to the weirwoods, the same as any other timber. They cut the carved faces down and burned them, and built upon the ground where they had stood. To the children, this was not clearing land. It was worse than murder. It was the blinding of their gods. So came the first true war for the continent. It was not one war, but 10,000 small ones, scattered across centuries, a slow and grinding struggle between two peoples who could barely understand each other. The first men had bronze and horses and numbers. The children had the forest they knew in their bones, and they had their magic. The songs tell of how they fought from ambush, loosing arrows of weirwood from the cover of the trees, how the giants came down out of the north to fight beside them, how the woods themselves seemed to turn against the invaders. For every man the children killed, though, more came across the eastern bridge, and the forests fell and the fields spread. And slowly, terribly, the first men kept winning ground. When it became clear that arrows and giants would not be enough, the children reached for the deepest power they had. The green seers gathered. The songs say they came together in the place men would later call Moat Cailin, in the boggy neck of Kor, the continent. And there they worked a magic so great that no human sorcery ever matched it. They called down their power upon the land bridge in the east, the long arm of rock by which the first men had walked into Westeros, and they broke it. The sea rose up, and the earth shattered, and the bridge was torn apart, swallowed beneath the waves, until only a scatter of islands remained where solid ground had been. The children meant to seal the door. They meant to cut Westeros off from the eastern lands forever, so that no more men could ever come. It was the single greatest act of magic in the history of the continent, and it failed at the only thing it was meant to do. The bridge was already too late to matter. By the time the children shattered it, the first men who needed to cross had already crossed. They were inside Westeros, in their thousands, already clearing forests and raising halls and burning weirwoods deep in the heart of the land. Breaking the bridge did not unmake them. It only ensured that the men already there would never leave and would never again face anything from across the sea, leaving them free to turn their full strength against the children who remained. The broken land in the south kept its name as a wound. Men came to call it the Arm of Dawn, the place where Westeros had once reached out to touch the world, and had that hand struck away. There is something worth holding on to in that. The first great act of power this continent ever witnessed was an act of desperation, worked by a frightened people who had waited too long. The children did not break the Arm of Dawn when the first men first appeared on the shore. They tried bronze against arrows first, and giants against horsemen, and only when those had failed did they unleash the deepest magic they had. By then, the thing they were trying to prevent had already happened. The flood was already in the house. Pulling down the door behind it changed nothing. This is a pattern the land would repeat across all the ages to come. Power arriving too late. The great weapon spent at the moment it could no longer save anyone. Walls raised after the enemy has already passed them. Oaths sworn after the danger has been forgotten. Fire called down on a war that is already lost. The children of the forest were the first to learn this lesson, and they learned it at the cost of their whole world. They had the strength to drown a continent's land bridge. They did not have the wisdom to use it in time. So the bridge was gone, and the men remained, and the long war ground on, with no door left to close. Forest by forest, river by river, the weirwoods kept falling, and the fields kept spreading. Neither side could destroy the other. The first men could not chase the children out of every wood and cave and bog. The children could not throw the men back into a sea they no longer had a road across. The killing went on for so long that the children born into it knew nothing else, generation after generation, until both peoples were exhausted by a war that neither one could win. And it was only when both sides had bled long enough to understand that the killing would never end on its own, that the two peoples did the one thing no later age of Westeros would ever manage so well. They stopped. They agreed to sit down across from one another, in the heart of the very magic they had been fighting over, and to make a peace. The place they chose was an island in the middle of a great lake near the center of the continent, a lake men would later name the God's Eye. The island was small, and it was thick with weirwoods. More of the white trees crowded together there than anywhere else in all of Westeros. Hundreds of carved and weeping faces standing close among the still water. To the children, it was the most sacred ground that remained to them. It was fitting that the war for the weirwoods should end beneath the largest gathering of them, left alive. The lords and heroes of the first men came to that island, and the green seers and wise ones of the children came to meet them. And there, after centuries of killing, the two peoples made a peace. The songs call it the Pact, and the terms of it were simple enough that even men who could not write could carry them in memory for thousands of years. The first men would keep the open lands, the coasts, the meadows, the high plains, the cleared ground where their fields and halls already stood. All of that was theirs to farm and to settle and to rule. In return, the children would keep the deep forests, and those woods would be theirs forever untouched. No man would raise an axe against the trees of the green places again. And above all, no man would ever again put steel to a weirwood. The white trees with their carved faces would stand. That was the heart of it. The war had begun over the weirwoods, and the peace was built on a promise to let them live. To bind the agreement, the legends say the children carved a face into every weirwood on that island, so that the old gods themselves would watch over the pact and witness any man who broke it. From that day, the place was called the Isle of Faces, and a holy order of men, called the Green Men, was said to keep it, tending the trees and guarding the peace down through the centuries. Whether the Green Men were real or only a story, no one who tells the tale can say for certain. But the island kept its name and its trees long after the men who first carved them had crumbled into the soil, and the peace held. This is the part that no later age of Westeros would ever quite believe. The pact did not hold for a generation, or for a few uneasy lifetimes. It held for thousands of years. The maesters who count such things speak of something close to 4,000 years of peace between men and children, and even if that number is a guess like all the deep numbers, it points at something true. Two peoples who had spent centuries slaughtering each other put down their weapons and simply stopped, and the stopping lasted longer than any kingdom, any dynasty, any war that would ever come after. This long quiet is what the songs call the Age of Heroes. It was the age in which the first men ceased to be invaders and became something rooted, a people of Westeros, no longer a flood pouring in from the east, but a settled folk with their own halls and their own bloodlines and their own kings. The land changed them as much as they had changed the land. They learned its rivers and its seasons. They built in stone where once they had built in timber and earth. And slowly across those long centuries, the deepest change of all worked its way into them. The first men took up the gods of the children. This is one of the strangest and most telling things in all the history of the continent. The men who had crossed the sea surely carried gods of their own out of the eastern lands, whatever those gods had been. But those gods did not survive the crossing of the years. Living among the weirwoods, sharing the land with the people who had carved them, the first men came to worship the same nameless gods the children worshipped, the old gods of the forest, the stream, and the stone, gods with no temples and no holy books, and no priests. Gods that had no faces of their own, except the faces carved into the white trees. The first men knelt before the weirwoods they had once cut down, and prayed to the very powers their fathers had warred against. The conquerors had adopted the religion of the conquered. The trees that the first men had burned by the thousand became in time the trees the first men held, most sacred of all. To this day, the men of the north keep a heart tree in their godswood, a weirwood with a carved face, and pray before it in silence. And the faith they keep is the faith they took from a people their ancestors nearly wiped from the earth. There is no stranger inheritance anywhere in Westeros than that. So for thousands of years, the two peoples lived side by side. The children kept to their forests and their caves and their hidden places, growing fewer and quieter as the centuries passed, and the first men spread across the open country and grew strong. They were not the same. They did not become one people, but they had found a way to share a single land without trying to destroy each other, and that arrangement outlasted everything. The thing worth holding on to from all of it is this: Westeros's longest and deepest peace did not come because one side finally won. It did not come from a great victory, or a final battle, or a conqueror strong enough to force his will on everyone. It came from the opposite of all that. It came because two peoples fought until they understood that neither could ever truly defeat the other, and then chose to stop. The peace was built not on triumph, but on the honest admission that the war could not be won. Both sides gave something up. The men gave up the forests and the weirwoods. The children gave up the open lands they could never have held anyway. And in exchange for what each surrendered, they bought 4,000 years of quiet. No age of Westeros after this one would ever learn that lesson again. The whole long history still to come, the kings and the conquests, the crowns won and lost, the dragons and the wars that burned whole castles to slag, is in one sense the story of a continent forgetting the single thing its oldest inhabitants had figured out, that peace does not have to mean victory, that two powers can stop fighting without one of them being destroyed. The first men and the children of the forest sat down on a holy island, carved their promise into 1,000 watching faces, and proved it could be done. And then the centuries rolled on, and their descendants forgot, and went back to the older and simpler belief that the only true end to a war is one side lying dead. But that forgetting was still far away. For now there was peace, the longest the land would ever know, and into that long quiet, the first men poured all the restless energy they no longer spent on fighting the children. They built, they founded houses and raised the first great seats of stone. And out of those peaceful centuries came the legends, the heroes and the kings, whose names the powerful of Westeros would still be claiming as their own ancestors 10,000 years later. These were the names that survived, not the dates, not the borders, not the true shape of who ruled what. Those are mostly gone. What came down through 10,000 years was a handful of heroes, larger than any man could really have been, each one credited with deeds no single life could hold. The first men could not yet write. They kept their history in song, passed mouth to mouth across the generations, and song does not preserve facts, it preserves giants. The greatest of them was Bran the Builder. The tales say he raised the wall at the end of the long night, and built Winterfell to guard the first, and that his hand was in the founding of Storm's End, and perhaps even the high towers of the High Tower at Old Town. No man lived long enough to do all of that, and the honest truth is that Bran the Builder is likely several builders across several ages, their separate works gathered under one ringing name. But House Stark traces its blood directly to him, and has for as long as there have been Starks. Every lord of Winterfell who ever sat the old throne of the kings of winter called that legendary figure his forefather. In the west there was Lan the Clever, who never lifted a sword that the songs admit to. The story goes that Lan took Casterly Rock, the greatest natural fortress in all of Westeros, from House Casterly, without spilling a drop of blood. He tricked them out of it by wit alone, slipping his own people into the halls and the family into the lordship, until one morning the Casterlys woke to find the rock was theirs no longer. Some say he stole gold from the sun itself to brighten his hair.
From Lan the Clever descend the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, golden-haired and rich beyond counting, and they have spent thousands of years insisting that the cunning of their founder still runs in their veins. In the south there was Garth Greenhand, the High King of the first men in the Reach, and the strangest of all the heroes. The Garth was less a warrior than a power of growth itself. Where he walked, the songs say, the fields turned golden behind him, and the barren places bloomed. Some tales make him a man, the first and greatest of the Reach's kings. Older and darker ones make him something closer to a god, a figure who demanded blood sacrifice for good harvest, and wore a crown of vines. From Garth and his many, many children sprang half the noble houses of the south, the gardeners who ruled the Reach from Highgarden, and the Tyrells who served them, and the High Towers, and the Oakhearts, and the Florents, and more besides, all of them claiming descent from the green god-king who made the land grow. And on the eastern coast, where the storms come in off the narrow sea, there was Durin God's Grief. His is the most human of the legends, and the saddest. Durin loved Elenay, a daughter of the sea god, and the goddess of the wind, and he won her and wed her. For the insult of it, the gods sent storm after storm to tear his castle down and kill his bride. So Durin built again, and the sea threw down what he built. He built a third time, and a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and each time the gods smashed his hall to rubble. 6 castles fell, the 7th stood. The songs say the young Bran the Builder helped him raise that final fortress, and that its walls were so thick and so cunningly curved that the storms broke against them and could not pull them down. That 7th castle was Storm's End, and it has never fallen to this day. From Durin came the line of Storm Kings, the Durandons, who ruled the Stormlands for Brath, thousands of years, until the last of them gave way to House Baratheon. There are dozens more. The Grey King of the Iron Islands, who lived 1,000 years and took a mermaid to wife. The Fisher Queens who ruled by the great lake at the heart of the continent. The Barrow Kings of the north. The Marsh Kings of the swamps. The warrior who founded House Dane, where a falling star came to earth and named his seat Starfall for it. Every region of Westeros has its founding hero, and every great house its founding ancestor, and almost all of them are said to come out of this same long, golden, half-remembered age. Out of these legends came the kingdoms. The first men had crossed the sea as scattered bands, but across the long peace they settled, and the settlements grew into halls, and the halls into petty kingdoms. The petty kingdoms warred and merged, and were slowly hammered into larger ones. By the end of the Age of Heroes, the continent was a patchwork of crowns. Kings of winter in the north, storm kings in the east, gardener kings in the Reach, river kings and mountain kings, and 100 lesser lords who called themselves king over a few hills and a river crossing. The great houses we will follow for the rest of this story were already taking shape, already raising their stone seats, already telling the tales that made them more than ordinary men. And the thing worth seeing clearly is this. Every one of these houses traced itself back to a hero of this age, and that is exactly the point. The Starks needed a Bran the Builder. The Lannisters needed a Lan the Clever. The Gardeners needed a Garth Greenhand, and the Durandons needed their Durin. The house that rules men needs a reason for its rule, something older and grander than the plain Sprookey. That an ancestor once had more swords than his neighbors. So the powerful reached back into the fog of the Age of Heroes and found there, or made there, a founder touched by gods and miracles, a beginning worthy of the power they held. Now this is the quiet truth, underneath all the golden legends. The men who ruled Westeros were inventing their own ancient legitimacy from the very start. The Age of Heroes
is not really a record of what happened 10,000 years ago.
It is the story the lords of a later age needed to be true, so that their crowns would seem to come from something more than conquest. A founder who stole gold from the sun sounds nobler than a clever thief who tricked a family out of their home. A king beloved of the gods sounds nobler than a warlord who killed the men in the next valley and took their land. The legends gilded the theft. They turned what was almost certainly a brutal age of small, vicious wars into a procession of giants and miracles, and they did it because the descendants of those wars wanted ancestors they could be proud of. We cannot peel the gold away and see what truly lies beneath. The men of that age left no writing, only the songs their heirs reshaped to suit themselves. What we are left with are the names: Bran, Lan, Garth, Durin, and the houses that still carry them like banners. Those houses would spend the next 10,000 years fighting one another for the right to rule Westeros, and every one of them would march to war, certain that its blood ran back to gods and heroes. The certainty came first. The proof was always just a story, and the whole long, bloody history still to come would be fought and taught by men who believed those stories down to the bone. Into that age of warring kings came something that did not care which man wore which crown. It came as winter, but not the winter the first men knew, the hard season that bites for a year or two, and then breaks. This winter did not break. The sun rose dimmer each day, and the cold deepened, and the snows came, and did not melt, and the season that should have ended simply went on, a year, then more, than a span of years no one could count, because the children born into that dark grew old in it, and died never having seen a true summer. The maesters call it the long night. It lasted a generation. The crops failed first, and then the herds, and then the people. Mothers smothered their own children rather than watch them starve. The living ate the dead. Whole villages went silent and stayed silent, the snow drawing over them like a sheet pulled over a corpse. And then out of the uttermost cold of the far north, in the heart of that endless dark, came the thing the cold had been hiding. The first men called them the others, pale, cold, beautiful in a terrible way. They came riding down out of the land of always winter, and where they passed the world froze harder still. They were not men, and they were not beasts. They were death, given shape and purpose, and they hated all warm and living things. Their swords were so cold, the steel of a mortal man shattered against them, and the worst of it was what they left behind. The men they killed did not stay dead. They rose again with eyes of pale blue ice, slaves to the cold that had killed them, and they turned their dead hands against the people they had loved. Every man the others slew became another soldier in their army. The dead marched south, and the living had no answer for them. It came very close to the end of everything. The songs of every people in Westeros remember this in their own words, and they agree on the shape of it. A darkness that fell over the whole world, a cold that meant to swallow every living thing, and a war that was very nearly lost. This was not one kingdom against another. This was the world against its own extinction. For all the crowns and all the heroes of the Age of Heroes, there came a winter in which it did not matter who was king, because there were going to be no more kings, no more men, no more anything that drew breath and felt warmth. What turned it back is a story half swallowed by time, and the songs that carry it are broken in places. The tale tells of the last hero, when all the armies of men had failed, and the kingdoms were falling one by one. A single man set out into the dead lands with 12 companions, a sword, a horse, and a dog, to find the children of the forest. He believed that the old people of the wood, the ones who had been in Westeros since before men, might know some magic that could end the long dark. It was a desperate hope and a long road. One by one, the cold took everything he had. His horse died, and then his companions, and then his sword froze and snapped, and his dog, and the females, alone, hunted across the white waste by the dead and the things that drove them. He found at last what he had come to find, and the children answered.
The songs grow thin here, and what truly happened in those frozen woods is mostly gone. But out of that meeting came an alliance. The children of the forest and the first men, the two peoples who had spent thousands of years killing each other for the right to the land, standing together at last, because there would be no land for either of them if the dead won. They gathered what was left of the living, they took their stand, and somewhere in the heart of the long night, they fought the battle the whole age had been moving toward. The first men call it the Battle for the Dawn. It was the war that decided whether the world would go on. The tales say a hero rose in it. Some name him Azor Ahai, far across the sea, and others give him no name at all, and that he carried a sword of fire, and that with it the others were broken and driven back into the cold from which they came. The dead lay down, the cold loosened, and slowly, impossibly, the sun grew warmer, the snows began to melt, and after a generation of darkness, dawn came back to the world. The long night ended. The others withdrew into the far north, beyond the edge of everything, and the world that survived them set about forgetting they had ever existed. That forgetting is the heart of it. The long night was the single greatest danger Westeros ever faced. Not a rival king, not a foreign invader, but an enemy that meant to end all life, everywhere, and very nearly did. And it is the one piece of its history that Westeros let slip almost entirely out of memory. The kingdoms remembered Bran the Builder and Lan the Clever in loving, gilded detail. The deeds of the Age of Heroes were sung in every hall, but the others, the thing that had truly almost killed them all, dwindled in the telling, until they became something to frighten children with on cold nights, a tale of grumpkins and snarks, of pale shadows in the dark, no more real to a southern lord than the monster under a child's bed. The reason for that is not a flattering one. The wars of men make for good songs. They have heroes you can name and enemies you can hate, and a winner who lives to tell it his way. The long night had none of that. It had no glory, only survival. Its enemy could not be reasoned with, or ruled, or used, and that makes it useless to the men who came after. There is no claim to be staked on having outlasted a winter, no crown to be won from it. So the lords of Westeros put their energy into the stories that served them, the founders and the conquests and the bloodlines, and they let the one story that should have outlived all the others fade into a nursery tale. The deadliest thing that ever came for them became a way to get children to sleep, but the men who lived through it did not forget so easily, not at first. Before the memory thinned, they did something. They knew that the cold had not died, only retreated, and that what had come once might come again. And so, while the alliance still held, and the terror was still fresh in living minds, they raised a defense against the return of the dark, a barrier at the very top of the world, between the lands of men and the lands of always winter. It was the greatest thing the people of Westeros would ever build, and they built it for an enemy their own descendants would refuse to believe in. The man the songs credit with it is Brandon the Builder, Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark, the same name attached to half the great works of the age. Whether one man raised the wall, or whether his name was simply hung on the labor of many, no one can say. But the thing itself is real, and it stands to this day. A wall of ice 300 miles long, stretching from the cold sea in the east to the mountains in the west, sealing off the top of the continent. In places it rises 700 feet into the air. A man standing at its foot cannot see the top of it. It is so vast that the cold pours off it, and the wind around it never fully stills. The tales say the children of the forest lent their magic to the making of it, and that spells are woven into the ice as surely as the ice itself is stacked. Whatever the truth of that, the wall was built to do one thing: to hold back what had come down out of the north, and to hold it back forever. But a wall is only stone, or in this case, only ice. It does not watch. It does not fight. A barrier left unmanned is a barrier that fails the first time it is truly tested. And so alongside the wall, there came an order of men sworn to hold it. They called themselves the Night's Watch, and they took a vow unlike any other in Westeros. They gave up land and title. They gave up wives and children, and any claim to the world south of the ice. They held no allegiance to any king or any house. Their only duty was to stand the wall and guard the realms of men against whatever might come from the dark beyond it. They wore black and nothing else. In the beginning, it was a great calling. The first of the watch were the heroes of the long night, men who had seen the dead walk and knew exactly what they were guarding against. A stronghold named the Night Fort was the first to be raised, the oldest and largest of the castles that would come to line the wall. And from there, they kept their watch, with the terror still fresh in them. Over the centuries, they built more keeps along the ice, until 19 castles stood guard at the grove, and the watch numbered in the thousands. The greatest lords of the north sent their sons to take the black, and to wear it was an honor, not a punishment. To feed and sustain them, the Starks gave the watch a stretch of land below the wall, a band of country running clear across the continent for the brothers to farm and work. They called it the gift, and later kings widened it, so that the new gift was added to the old. The men of the wall had fields and villages to keep them fed while they kept their watch. That is how it began. What it became is a slower and a sadder story. The thing about guarding against an enemy that does not come back is that the guarding loses its meaning. Year after year, the brothers climbed the wall and looked north, and saw nothing but snow and worst and empty cold. A generation passed, and then another, and then so many that no living man had seen an other or a dead thing walking. The vow stayed the same, but the reason behind it thinned, the way the memory of the long night itself had thinned. The men of the watch went on standing the wall, but fewer and fewer of them could have told you what they were truly standing it for. The ritual outlived the fear that made it. North of the wall, beyond its shadow, there were men, descendants of first men, who had been caught on the wrong side when the ice went up, or who had wandered there in the long years after, living free of any lord or law. The kingdoms to the south called them wildlings. They called themselves the free folk, because they bowed to no king and held no land and lived by their own hard ways, in a country that would kill a soft man in a single night. To the brothers on the wall, the free folk became the enemy that actually showed up. Raiders who climbed the ice or slipped through the gaps, who stole and killed and vanished back into the haunted forest. So the watch turned its swords on living men, on the very people it shared an ancestry with, and slowly forgot that these were never the thing it had been founded to stop. There is a darker thread still, older than the drift into raiders and ritual, and the North never quite let it die. They tell of the Night's King. The story goes that in the early days of the Watch, when the Order was still young, the 13th man to command it stood one night atop the wall, and saw a woman in the snow beyond it. A woman with skin as white as the moon, and eyes like blue stars, cold as ice to the touch. He chased her, and he caught her, and the moment he gave his seed to her, he gave her his soul as well. He brought her back to the Night Fort, and declared himself a king, and her his queen, and for 13 years they ruled there together. In those years, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch was no protector of the realm at all. The tales say he made sacrifices to the cold gods, that the others came and went freely past the wall, that whatever he had become served the very dark his order existed to hold back. It took a Stark and a wildling king together, the king in the north and the king beyond the wall, joining forces to bring him down. When it was over, they struck his very name from every record, so that no one would ever again know what he had truly been called. The name Night's King is only the title the songs remember him by. The thing the story carries beneath its frost and its horror is a warning the watch was meant never to forget, that the men sworn to guard the dark could become a door for it if they ever lost the meaning of what they were. But meaning is exactly what the centuries wore away. The wall still stood, taller and colder than anything else men had ever raised. The vow was still spoken, word for word, by every brother who took the black. The castles still lined the ice, and yet the heart had gone out of it. The thousands dwindled to hundreds. The honor curdled until the watch became a place to send criminals and bastards, and unwanted, sons, men with nowhere else to go. The greatest defense ever built in Westeros was left in the hands of an order that had forgotten its own enemy. That is the shape of it, and it is the shape of so much that follows.
Westeros raised its mightiest work against the deadliest thing it ever faced, and then spent thousands of years letting both the work and the memory rot, certain, in its warm halls to the south, that the cold was only a story. The wall would keep standing. Only now, no one knew what it was standing against. South of the wall, in the great cold country it shielded, House Stark was already doing what the Watch could not, turning a hard land into a single crown. They sat at Winterfell, in the castle the same builder was said to have raised with hot springs, running through its walls to keep the worst of the cold from the stone. In the south, the lords were beginning to call them the Kings of Winter, and the name fit them better than any title in Westeros. They were not a warm people or a forgiving one. They had survived the long night and the centuries after by being exactly as cold as the country that bred them, and they ruled the same way, slowly, patiently, without mercy, taking one rival at a time, and never once forgetting an enemy. Because the North was not one kingdom when the Starks began, it was many. The land was vast, larger than all the southern kingdoms put together, and across its forests and moors and mountains, a dozen petty kings each held their own corner, and called themselves lord of it. To make the North one, the Starks had to break every other crown in it, one after another, across thousands of years of war that left almost no songs behind. What survives is a list of the houses they destroyed, and the list is long. There was the Warg King, who held the Wolveswood in the days before the Starks reached it. The tales say he was a skin changer, a man who could send his mind into beasts and birds, and that he kept green seers at his side, and the beasts of the forest at his command. When the Starks went to war with him, they killed his sons, took his daughters, and put his whole line to the sword. Whatever magic he had was not enough. The Wolveswood became Starkland, and the Warg King became another conquered name. There were the Barrow Kings, who ruled from the great Barrow Mounds in the center of the north, and claimed a title older than the Starks themselves. The first king, the first man to rule over other men in Westeros. For long years, the two houses warred, the kings of the Barrows against the kings of Winterfell, until at last the Barrow kings bent the one knee. The Starks bound them by marriage and by oath, and House Dustin held the Barrowlands after, no longer kings, but bannermen. There were the Marsh Kings of the Neck, who ruled the swamps, and the bogs where the north narrows, to a thin, choked waste of wetland. The Crannogmen of the Neck were not easily beaten. They knew their marshes the way no invader ever could, and a soft army that marched into that country sank into it and was never seen again. The Starks did not conquer the Neck so much as outlast it. A king of winter took the Marsh King's daughter to wife, and the line of the Marsh Kings ended, and House Reed held the Neck after, as the Starks' most loyal men. From that union, the North gained the one defense no army from the South could ever break, a wall of water and reed and quicksand, guarding the only road in. And there was the kingdom, at Sea Dragon Point, on the wild western coast, drowned and broken in wars, now half forgotten, its people scattered, its name barely surviving. Wherever a crown rose in the north, Winterfell rose against it, and Winterfell almost always won. But of all the houses the Starks broke, one matters more than the rest, because its grudge did not die when its crown did. In the east of the north, on the banks of a river they named the Weeping Water, there stood a grim fortress called the Dreadfort, and in it ruled the Red Kings of House Bolton. The Boltons were old as the Starks or older, and they were the one northern house the Kings of Winter could never quite swallow. They warred for generations, Stark against Bolton, Winterfell against the Dreadfort, and the wars between them
were uglier than any others in the north. The Boltons had a custom that set them apart from every other house in Westeros, and made even hardened men recoil. They flayed their enemies. They took the skin from living captives and wore it. They hung the flayed skins of dead Starks on the walls of the Dreadfort as trophies. Their banner was a flayed man, red on pink, and they meant it exactly as it looked. More than once, the Boltons came close to taking Winterfell itself. A Red King is said to have worn a cloak made from the skins of Stark kings he had killed. But in the end, the cold patience of Winterfell wore them down, as it wore down everyone else. After a war that the records barely preserve, the last Red King of the Dreadfort knelt and gave up his crown, and House Bolton became sworn men of House Stark. They knelt, they did not forgive. The Boltons surrendered their crown to Winterfell, but they never accepted that they were the lesser house, never stopped believing that they had as much right to rule the North as the wolves who had beaten them. Across the centuries, they outlawed the worst of their old customs to keep the Starks content, and they served, and they waited. A grudge like that does not burn hot. It goes cold and quiet and patient, the same way the North itself is patient, and it can wait a very long time, 1,000 years if it has to, for the moment when a Stark is weak, and a Bolton can finally pay back the conquest that made him bend the knee. When it was all over, the North was won. From the wall in the cold north, down to the neck in the boggy south, from the Wolveswood and the stony shore in the west, to the Dreadfort and the eastern sea, every petty crown had been broken or absorbed, and over all of it sat a single king at Winterfell. The kings of Winter ruled the largest realm in Westeros, larger than any king in the south could dream of, held together not by warmth or by faith, but by sheer cold endurance, and the memory of every house that had tried to stand against them, and failed. And here is the difference that would shape everything to come. South of the Neck, in the gentler and richer lands, the same age of war produced the opposite result. The South fractured. It split into many kingdoms that rose and fell and rose again, each one a separate crown, each one jealous of the rest. But the North was hammered into a single shape by a single house, and it stayed that way. One king, one faith, the old gods of the Weirwoods. One people, hard and unforgiving, and slow to forget. It was a stronger thing than anything in the South, and a colder one. Winterfell had unified the North. It had not made the North love it, beneath the snow and the loyalty, in a grim fortress on the weeping water. A flayed banner waited for its day. While the Starks were breaking the last crowns in the cold north, a new people had crossed the narrow sea from the east, and they were nothing like any enemy the first men had faced before. They were the Andals, and they came out of a land called Andalos on the far shore in the hills of Essos, where the old stories said the father himself had once walked among them. They were taller and fairer than the first men, golden-haired and grey-eyed, and they came not as raiders or wanderers, but as a migration, a whole people in flight, crossing the sea in ships, generation after generation, looking for new land to take. The Maesters argue endlessly about when it began. Some say 2,000 years ago, some say 4,000, some say 6. The Andals themselves kept records that pushed it back further. Still, the truth is buried under too many centuries to recover, but the shape of it is clear enough. They came in waves, and they did not stop coming. Two things came with them that changed Westeros forever. The first was iron. The first men still fought in bronze, the same bronze they had carried across the Arm of Dawn 12,000 years before. The Andals brought steel, iron weapons, iron armor, iron-shod horses, and the knowledge of how to work the metal that the first men did not have. On a battlefield it was no contest. Bronze shatters against iron. The first men were brave and they were many, but bravery does not mend a broken blade, and one Andal knight in ironmail could cut down men who had no answer to him. Wherever the two peoples met in open war, the iron won. The second thing they brought was a god, or rather 7 of them. The Andals did not worship the old gods of the Weirwoods. They worshipped the 7, the father, the mother, the warrior, the smith, the maiden, the crone and the stranger, 7 faces of a single god, the faith that still rules most of Westeros to this day, and they did not come to share their faith. They came to impose it. They believed the conquest was holy, that the 7 had sent them across the sea to take this land and cleanse it of the old gods and the older things that still lived in its forests. They carved the 7-pointed star into their own flesh as a mark of their devotion, cut it into the palms of their hands, so the symbol would be on them always, and they sailed under it, the way later conquerors would sail under banners. To a people fighting a holy war, the weirwoods were not sacred, they were idols, and so the Andals did the one thing that the first men, even at the height of their old war, had finally agreed never to do. They cut the weirwoods down. Everywhere they conquered, the white trees with the carved faces were felled and burned, and the carved faces that had watched over the land for thousands of years were destroyed wherever the Andals could reach them. The pact that had held since the Isle of Faces, the long agreement between men and the children, meant nothing to people who had never signed it and worshipped a god who told them the trees were evil, and the children themselves had nowhere left to hide. South of the Neck in the rich green country, the Andals wanted most. The children of the forest were hunted and slaughtered without mercy. Whatever remnants of them still lived in the southern woods, holding to the secret places they had kept since the Dawn Age, were found and killed or driven out. The green seers, the singers, the small people who had carved the faces and shaped the land instead of conquering it, south of the Neck, they simply ended. After the Andals, no man in the southern kingdoms would ever again claim to have seen one. They passed out of the world there and into legend, and the only places they survived were the deep north beyond the wall, and a few hidden hollows the conquerors never reached. The first men kingdoms fell the same way, one after another. The Andals did not take the south in a single war. They took it the way water takes a shore, in wave after wave across centuries, each landing pushing further inland than the last. Some first men kings met them in battle and were destroyed. Others were cleverer. They saw which way the tide was running and made peace instead of war. They married their daughters to Andal warlords, took the new faith, and kept their lands and their lives by bending rather than breaking. Bit by bit, the two peoples blended. Andal blood mixed with first men blood until the lords of the south could claim descent from Cald. Both and the old gods gave way to the 7 across the whole of the southern continent, save in a few stubborn corners where a heart tree still stood in a godswood behind castle walls. But there was one place the Andals could not take, and the reason was the boggy country the Starks had won so long ago. Every army that tried to march into the north died in the Neck. The wet, choked, narrow waste of land that House Reed held for Winterfell was the perfect ground to stop an invasion, and the worst possible launch one. The Andals came in their iron mail on their heavy horses, and the marshes swallowed them. The Crannog men knew every path and pool and patch of solid ground. They struck from the reeds and vanished back into the shadows. Armored knights who left the road sank and drowned in armor worth more than he was. Time and again the Andals tried the Neck. Time and again the swamps broke them. They could not get a host through, and so the iron tide that drowned the whole of the south rolled up against the Neck and stopped. North of it the old world held. Winterfell still kept the old gods. The weirwoods still stood in the northern godswoods with their faces intact. The first men blood in the north stayed mostly unmixed, and the Andals, who had taken 6 of the kingdoms to come, never took the 7th. This is the invasion that split Westeros in 2, and the split never truly healed. South of the Neck became a different country. New gods, new blood, new ways. The faith of the 7, and the heritage of the Iron Men from across the sea. North of it stayed what it had always been, the last great keep of the first men, and the old gods, the one part of the continent the Andals could not conquer. Everything that comes after carries that line through it. When southern lords looked north, they saw a hard, strange, backward people who still prayed to trees. When Northmen looked south, they saw soft converts, who had thrown away the old gods for new ones the moment iron came ashore. Both were looking across the same wound.
The Andals had remade most of a continent, but they had not made it one. They had only added another layer of conquest on top of all the others, another people certain they were the last and the rightful owners of the land. And out of the kingdoms they founded, the next 1,000 years of war were about to take shape. Out of that long conquest, new crowns rose in the south, and most of them belonged to families who had arrived as invaders and stayed to call themselves kings. The kingdoms the Andals built were not founded by ancient right. They were founded by men who took what they wanted and were strong enough to keep it. The houses that rose to power still rule Westeros today.
Begin with the Vale, the mountain-ringed valley in the east, where the Andals first came ashore in real strength. The first men who held it were a people called the First Kings, and they fought hard for their high green country. But the Andals kept landing, and at last, one of their warlords broke the old line for good. His name was Sir Artis Arryn, and the songs call him the Falcon Knight. The legend says he slew the last of the first men's mountain kings on the Giant's Lance, the great peak that towers over the Vale, with a giant falcon at his side. From that victory came House Arryn, and the seat they raised at the top of the world, the Eyrie, a castle so high it sits among the clouds. The story even gives them a motto fit for conquerors who fell out of the sky, as high as honor, but stripped the falcon and the legend away, and what remains is plain enough. An Andal warlord killed the king who was already there and took his kingdom. In the Reach, the broad and fertile heartland of the south, the conquest went differently. There the first men kings were House Gardner, who traced themselves back to Garth Greenhand himself, and ruled from Highgarden, and they were too strong and too well-rooted to simply throw down. So when the Andals came to the Reach, the Gardners did not break before them. They absorbed them. They took Andal knights into their service, married Andal blood into their line, and bent the new faith and the new people to their own crown, rather than the other way around. The Gardners kept their throne for thousands of years longer, because they were clever enough to make the invaders into vassals. It was the rarest outcome of the Andal age, the old kings surviving the flood by riding it, and it made the Reach the wealthiest and most chivalrous of the southern kingdoms. In the Stormlands, the oldest line of all held on. House Durrandon, the Storm Kings, claimed descent from Duran God's Grief, the man who had taken a goddess to wife and raised Storm's End against the fury of the sea. They had worn the Storm crown since the Age of Heroes, and when the Andals came, the Storm Kings did what they had always done. They fought and they endured. Storm's End never fell. The line bent and married, and took Andal blood as the others did. But the crown stayed Durrandon, and for a long age, the Storm Kings were among the mightiest in Westeros, their borders pushing, west into the Reach, and north into the Riverlands, whenever a strong king sat the throne. They were warriors before they were anything else, and the storm in their blood would outlast their name itself. And then there were the Riverlands, the green and watered country in the heart of the continent. And the Riverlands had the worst luck of any kingdom in Westeros. They were rich, and they were open, and they had no natural walls to hide behind. Every neighbor wanted them, and across the centuries, nearly every neighbor took them. The first men kings of the rivers fell to the Andals like the rest, and the rivers passed into Andal hands. But that was only the beginning of their misfortune. Where the Vale and the West and the Reach each settled under one ruling house, the Riverlands never could. They were conquered and reconquered, ruled from the Stormlands one century and the West the next, carved up between stronger kingdoms again and again. The Riverlords learned to be survivors above all else, to bend to whoever held the whip and wait for the next master, because a master always came. It was the one part of the South that never truly belonged to itself. Look across all of it, and a single truth runs underneath every crown. The Arryns fell on the Vale out of the sky and killed its king. The Lannisters stole the rock from the family that built it, The gardeners survived only by swallowing the people who came to destroy them. The Durandans held by the sword, and nothing else. The River Kings rose and fell so many times that no one could say whose land it truly was. Not one of these houses could point to a beginning that was clean. Every great southern house we know was itself once a conqueror or a usurper. Legitimacy in Westeros is just a theft grown old enough that everyone has forgotten the blood it started with. That is the irony that sits beneath all the pride of the great houses. The same lords who would one day sneer at upstarts and pretenders, who would speak of ancient right and noble blood and the long honor of their lines, were every one of them descended from someone who had taken what was not his. The Falcon Knight, the clever liar, the warlord with the seven-pointed star cut into his palm. Time turned the crime into a dynasty, and the dynasty into a legend, and the legend into a birthright. Wait long enough, and a stolen castle becomes a family seat held since the dawn of days. So the map of the South took the shape it would keep for the next 1,000 years. The Eyrie in the mountains of the Vale, Casterly Rock above its rivers of gold, High Garden in the flowering reach, Storm's End on its battered cliffs, and the Riverlands in the middle, forever changing hands. 7 kingdoms were forming out of the wreckage of the old world, each with its king and his crown and his careful story about why it deserved them. But the South was only part of the continent. Out in the cold grey water to the west, on a cluster of bleak and stony islands, another people had been growing into something entirely their own, and they had built a whole religion around the very thing the southern lords pretended to be ashamed of. The islands sat off the western coast, a scatter of grey rocks lashed by cold sea and colder wind, and almost nothing good grew there. The soil was thin, the harvest poor, the weather cruel. A people who lived on such islands had 2 choices. They could be poor, or they could take what they needed from those who were not. The Ironborn made their choice long ago, and they made it the heart of everything they believed. They were their own folk, and they had been since the deep past. The Maesters reckoned them first men in blood, though the Ironborn themselves told a stranger story, one of a people raised up out of the sea by a god of their own. Whatever their origins, they grew apart from the rest of Westeros. They did not pray to the old gods of the Weirwoods, or later to the 7 of the Andals. They prayed to the drowned god, a deity as harsh as the water that surrounded them. The drowned god had made the Ironborn to reave and to raid, to carve out kingdoms and make their names known in fire and blood. Their priests held that what was dead could never die, but rose again, harder and stronger, and they made that faith real in the only way they knew. They drowned their own. A man who would serve the drowned god was held under the seawater until his life left him, and then he was brought back, the water pressed from his lungs, born again into the god's service. It was a religion built for a people who lived hard and expected to die at sea. Out of that faith came what they called the Old Way, and the Old Way was the soul of the Ironborn. A true man did not farm, and he did not trade, and he did not toil in a field, or bend over a forge for his power. A true man took what he wanted from weaker men, across the water, and he wore what he took with pride. They made a virtue of it, and they gave it a name, the iron price. A thing won by gold or labor was paid for in the coin of cowards. A thing won by sword and axe, taken from an enemy's hand, or his hall, or his corpse, was paid for in the iron price, and only that was worthy of a real man. A captain who wore a chain of gold was meant to have killed the man he took it from. To buy such a thing would have shamed him. Where every other people in Westeros built a story to hide the theft at the root of their power, the Ironborn built a whole religion to celebrate it. They did not pretend to be ashamed of what they were. They sang about it. Their oldest legends gathered around a single figure, the Grey King, who is said to have ruled the islands in the dawn of years for more than 1,000 winters. The tales heaped wonder upon wonder on him. They said he had taken a mermaid to wife and lit the seas on fire and lived so long his hair and beard and skin turned the grey of driftwood, and gave him his name. Most of all, they said he had slain Naga, a great sea dragon, the largest monster ever to live in the waters of the world. From the bones of Naga, the Grey King raised himself a hall with the dead beast, ribs for rafters, and his jaws for a throne, and there he ruled, until the drowned god himself called him down beneath the waves. The ribs of Naga still stand on the holy island of Old Wick, weathered white stones that the Ironborn hold sacred to this day. Around them, their kings were chosen for thousands of years. How much of the Grey King ever lived is anyone's guess, but the islands believed in him. The Ironborn wished to be a man who killed a god's own monster and built his house out of the bones. For most of their history, the Ironborn kept to their rocks and their reaving, raiding the coasts and warring among themselves, no single hand ruling all the islands. In time that changed, House Hoare rose to the kingship, the black-blooded line that the Ironborn called the Kings of the Iron Islands. Under the Hoares, the ambition of the Ironborn grew past the shores of their own grey home. They looked east, across the water, to the soft green wealth of the mainland, and they took it. The Hoares pushed onto the coast, and then drove deep inland, and the country they seized was the one with the worst luck in all of Westeros. The Riverlands, rich and open, and forever changing hands, fell once more, this time to the men from the sea. The Riverlords, who had learned across the centuries to bend to whatever master came next, bent again. Now, they served kings who answered to the drowned god, and ruled them with the iron price. The greatest and the proudest of those kings was the last of them. His name was Harren, called Harren the Black, and he held both the Iron Islands and the Riverlands together in his fist, the largest dominion the Ironborn ever carved out. Harren wanted a seat to match his power, something that would stand for 1,000 years and tell every man who saw it exactly how great the Hoares had become. So beside the God's Eye, the great lake in the heart of his river country, he raised a castle unlike any other in Westeros. He called it Harrenhal, and it was monstrous. Its towers rose higher than any built before. Its walls were so thick and tall that no engine could hope to break them. Its halls could have swallowed lesser castles whole. It took 40 years to build. Harren bled the Riverlands white to raise it, working the riverfolk to death in the quarries and the timber camps, burning their forests, and beggaring their lords to feed his vanity in stone. The weirwoods of the region were cut down for its beams. The labor of a generation went into it, and there is a grim truth folded into all that stone. The Ironborn had made a faith out of taking, a creed that said the only honest wealth was the wealth wrenched from a weaker hand. Harrenhal was the iron price made enormous, a mountain of plunder shaped into walls, built on the broken backs of a conquered people to glorify the men who had conquered them. It was the proudest thing the Ironborn ever raised, and it was meant to be unconquerable. No army could storm those walls. No siege could starve out so vast a hold. But Harren had built against the wrong enemy. On the very day his great castle was at last finished, far to the east, a different kind of power had already come ashore, on the coast of Westeros. A power that did not care how thick a wall was, or how high a tower stood. The Ironborn had spent 40 years learning that stone could not be broken by any force they wane. They had never reckoned with fire that fell from the sky. Harrenhal, the grandest monument the Old Way ever produced, would become the first place in all of Westeros that the dragons burned. Long before any dragon came ashore on Westeros, that same fire had already driven a whole people from their homeland. Far across the narrow sea in the middle of the eastern continent, there ran a great river called the Rhoyne. It was the largest river in the known world, wide and slow and gentle, and along its banks lived the Rhoynar. They were a people of the water in every way. The Ironborn were a people of the sea, but they had built the opposite of the Old Way. They did not reave. They raised graceful cities on the riverbanks, traded in peace, worshipped the river itself, and the lesser gods of its streams, and they were ruled in many places by women as well as men. For a long age they prospered. Then Valyria came. The dragon lords of the freehold were spreading east and west in those centuries, hungry for land and for slaves, and their roads of conquest ran straight through the Rhoynar's country. There were wars along the river, terrible ones, and the Rhoynar did not always lose. One of their princes, a man remembered as Garin, raised an army, said to number in the hundreds of thousands, and met the Valyrians in a battle that should have saved his people. He beat them, and then the dragon lords answered in fire. They came with their dragons, and they burned the river country until almost nothing was left of Gruit. The cities fell. The water itself was said to have sickened. Garin was taken and died caged, cursing his enemies, and the Rhoynish world that had stood for thousands of years was finished in a generation. Out of that ruin came one woman who refused to die with her people. Her name was Nymeria, a warrior queen of one of the broken river cities, and she understood something the dead princes had not. There was no winning against dragons. To stay was to be burned. So she gathered the survivors, the women, and the children, and the old men, and the few warriors left, every Rhoynar who would follow her, and she put them onto ships. 10,000 ships, the histories say. Though that number is the kind that grows in the telling, what is certain is that she led a fleet larger than anything those waters had ever seen, packed with a whole shattered nation, and she sailed away from the only home they had known. She had no destination she could be sure of. She had only the certainty that anywhere was better than the ashes behind her. The voyage was a long agony. Nymeria's fleet wandered the southern seas for years, landing where it could, losing ships and people to storms and sickness and slavers at every stop. They tried to settle more than once, and each time it failed. They were taken in and then turned out, given barren islands where they starved, set upon by people who saw a fleet of desperate refugees as easy plunder. Thousands who had survived the dragons died on the water instead. By the time Nymeria finally turned her ships toward Westeros and brought them to land on its southern shore, in the dry red country men would later call Dorne, the people who climbed out onto the sand were the worn-down remnant of a remnant. They had crossed half the world to reach a hard, thirsty land at the bottom of a strange continent, and Nymeria looked at it and decided it would do. Then she did the thing for which she is remembered above all else. She burned the ships. Every one of them, the whole great fleet that had carried her people across the world, she put to the torch on the Dornish shore. It was the most deliberate act of her life. As long as the ships remained, some of her people would dream of sailing on, of going back, of looking for somewhere better. Nymeria killed that dream with fire of her own. There would be no going back and no going on. This was the end of the road. Her people would make their home here in this dry red land, or they would make their graves here. But they would do it together, and they would do it now. By burning the boats, she told them, in a way no speech could, that they were no longer a fleet of refugees. They were Dornishmen. Dorne at that time was not one country. It was a scatter of petty kings and lords, first men and Andals mingled together, each holding his own stretch of desert and mountain, and fighting all the others. A fleet of foreign refugees should have been swallowed up or driven into the sea. Instead, Nymeria did what no one born to that land had managed. She picked a side, and she picked well. Among the Dornish lords was a man named Mors Martell, whose house was strong, but not the fourth strongest, and Nymeria joined her people and her cause to his. She married him, and together they made war on all the rest. With the Rhoynar's numbers and Nymeria's will behind him, Mors Martell broke king after king. There were defeats along the way, and there was at least one moment where the cause nearly died. But Nymeria did not break. When it was over, the petty kingdoms of Dorne were gone, and in their place there was one realm, ruled from one seat by House Martell. But it was Nymeria who ruled it. Mors died in the wars, and it was she who held Dorne together afterward. She who put down the rebellions and sent troublesome lords across the sea in chains. She who governed for the rest of her long life. And here the Rhoynar left their deepest mark on Westeros. Everywhere else on the continent, a man's eldest son, inherited before any daughter, and a woman who ruled in her own name, was a rare and contested thing. Dorne kept the Rhoynish way instead. There the eldest child inherited, son or daughter alike, and women held land and led armies, and sat as ruling princesses without anyone thinking it strange. The Martells did not even call themselves kings. They took the title Prince and Princess of Dorne in the Rhoynish fashion, and they kept it for thousands of years. So Dorne became something that existed nowhere else in Westeros. It was a blending, first men, and Andal and Rhoynar, all poured together under the desert sun, with its own laws, its own customs, its own stubborn refusal to be like the rest. Its people were darker, its inheritance fairer to its women, its temper hotter and harder to govern. And all of it flowed from one decision, made on a beach by a queen who had lost everything. Every other corner of Westeros was shaped by conquerors who came hunting land and wealth and power. Dorne alone was shaped by a woman who came with nothing, fleeing fire, and chose this poor red country, not because she wanted it, but because she would not let her people die. She built a kingdom out of refusal, and she made it in her own image. That is why Dorne would stay different to the very end, defiant and unbroken, when everything around it bent. It had been forged by someone who had already lost her homeland once, and meant never to kneel again. The dragons that had burned the Rhoynar would one day come for Westeros, too, and 6 kingdoms out of 7 would fall to them. Dorne, the land Nymeria built, would be the one that did not. The dragons that burned the Rhoynar had a home, and it was the most powerful place in the world. Far to the east, on a great peninsula reaching out into the sea, stood the freehold of Valyria. It had begun as nothing much, a people of shepherds living among a range of volcanoes they called the 14 Flames. But in those smoking mountains, they found dragons, and they learned to tame them, and everything changed. A nation that rides dragons does not stay a nation of shepherds for long. Within a few thousand years, the Valyrians had built an empire that stretched across half a scape continent and ruled the known world. Their power rested on 3 things. The first was the dragons themselves, a weapon no rival could match. The second was sorcery, for the Valyrians were masters of magic in ways that have never been equaled since. They worked stone with fire and spells, until their roads and their walls seemed to flow rather than to have been built. And the fused black stone they made has outlasted everything around it. The third thing was the one men prefer to forget. Valyria ran on slaves. The 14 Flames were riddled with mines, and the dragon lords drove their slaves into those mines in numbers beyond counting, to die in the dark, digging out the gold and the iron that paid for the empire. The glory of Valyria and the suffering beneath it were the same things seen from 2 sides. The dragon lords were not kings. The freehold had no single ruler, no crown, no throne. It was governed by its great families, perhaps 40 of them at the height, the houses that owned dragons, and therefore owned everything among themselves. They competed for wealth and land and honor, and they intermarried close, brother to sister, to keep their dragon blood pure and their power within the family. Together, these families ruled the freehold as something between a council and a free-for-all. And for 5,000 years, no power on earth could stand against them. The one rival that had tried was the old empire of Gis, to the south, which had been ancient and mighty before Valyria was anything at all. There were 5 great wars between them, and Valyria won everyone. In the last of them, the Valyrians did to the Giscari capital what they would later do to the Rhoynar. They burned the city of Old Gis to ash, threw down its walls, sowed its fields with salt and sulfur so nothing would grow. And that was the end of the only civilization that had ever rivaled them. After that, there was no rival. There was only Valyria and the lesser peoples who lived in its shadow and paid it tribute. Among all the Dragon Lord families, one of the least was a house called Targaryen. They owned dragons which made them lords, but they were not among the great and powerful houses of the freehold. They were a minor branch, distinguished mostly by their looks, for they had the silver-gold hair and the pale violet eyes that the close Valyrian marriages sometimes produced. And they kept those marriages close themselves, brother wedding sister, generation after generation. Around 100 years before the end, the Targaryens did something that made no sense to anyone who saw it. They packed up their household, their dragons, and their wealth, and they left Valyria entirely. They sailed west to a bleak, smoking island at the very edge of the Valyrian world, a rock in the narrow sea off the coast of Westeros, and they settled there in a castle they raised of fused black stone. They called the island Dragonstone. To the great families they left behind, it must have looked like a small house, removing itself to the far provinces, giving up the center of the world for a wind-swept island on the frontier. The reason was a dream. One of the Targaryen daughters, a girl named Daenerys, was what later ages would call a dreamer, someone who saw things that had not yet happened. Daenerys dreamed that Valyria would be destroyed. Not defeated, not diminished, but destroyed utterly. The whole freehold and everything in it swallowed in a single catastrophe. Her father Aenar believed her, whether he believed because he loved her, or because he had seen enough of her dreams come true, to be afraid, no one can say now. But he believed her enough to abandon the heart of the empire on the strength of a child's vision, and to move his family to the safest, distant rock he could find. The other dragon lords kept their seats at the center of the world where the power was, where the wealth was, where any sensible family would stay. The Targaryens went to the edge and waited. Then the dream came true. A little over a decade after the Targaryens reached Dragonstone, the 14 flames erupted all at once. The mountains that had given Valyria its dragons broke open together in a single moment, and the land itself came apart. Every hill exploded into fire. The sea poured in where the peninsula had been. The black stone roads, and the soaring towers, and the families in their palaces, the dragons in the sky, and the slaves in the mines, all of it was gone in an afternoon. Men would call it the doom of Valyria, the greatest civilization the world had ever known. 5,000 years of empire that no army could touch, ended not by any enemy, but by the ground it stood on. The sea where Valyria had been became a poisoned, smoking ruin that sailors would not cross for fear of what still lived in it. Every great dragon lord family died in the doom, everyone save the small house that had left. That is the strange weight of it. The Targaryens were not the strongest of the dragon lords, nor the wisest, nor the most favored. They were a minor family who happened to have a daughter who dreamed, and a father who listened, and the luck or the foresight to be standing on a rock at the edge of the world when the center of it burned. The doom did not choose them. It simply destroyed everyone else and left them behind. And in doing so, it handed them the one thing that had been spread across 40 families a moment before, and now belonged to them alone. They were the last dragon lords in the world. The dragons were gone everywhere else, dead in the fire with their masters, and the sorcery that had bred and ridden them was gone with the Valyrians who had known it. What remained was a single small family on a single small island, holding the last few dragons left alive anywhere on earth. They were not a great power. For 100 years after the doom, they sat quietly on Dragonstone, while the cities of the east tore at the corpse of the freehold, and they kept to their rock, and tended their dragons, and married brother to sister, as they always had. No one thought much of them, but the entire future of Westeros had just been decided, and not one person living on that continent knew it. The fate of the 7 kingdoms, the throne every great house would one day fight and die for, the dynasty that would rule for 300 years, all of it had been settled by a disaster on the far side of the world. The doom emptied the earth of dragons and left exactly one family, holding the only ones that remained. Sooner or later, a family that owns the only weapon that matters looks west across a narrow sea and begins to wonder what it might be worth. For 100 years, the Targaryens waited, and then one of them stopped waiting. His name was Aegon, and he was the head of the house on Dragonstone, a man who held the largest of the 3 dragons left alive on the island. That dragon was called Balerion, the Black Dread, and he had grown so vast in the years since the doom that he could swallow a horse whole and cast a shadow over whole towns when he flew. Aegon had 2 sisters, and in the Valyrian way, they were also his 2 wives. Visenya, the elder, was a warrior, hard and unsmiling, who carried a Valyrian steel sword and rode the dragon Vhagar. Rhaenys, the younger, was the opposite, charming and quick to laugh, and she rode the youngest of the 3, Meraxes. 3 siblings, 3 dragons. It was not much of an army. It was enough. Westeros, at that time, was not 1 country, but 7, and the 7 were always at war with one another. There was no single crown, no shared law, nothing that bound the North to Dorne, or the Iron Islands to the Reach, except old hatreds and a Fook shared coastline. The kings of these realms had fought each other for thousands of years, and saw no reason to stop. Across the narrow sea, Aegon watched all of it, and he kept in his hall a great table carved into the shape of Westeros, a map of a country that did not yet exist. He had decided that it would. He landed at the mouth of a quiet river on the eastern coast, at a place where 3 small hills rose above the water, and he raised a crude wooden fort there. In time, that fort would grow into the greatest city in Westeros, King's Landing. But on the day he came ashore, it was nothing. He had perhaps a few thousand men and his 3 dragons, against a continent of kings who could each field more soldiers than he had ever commanded. By any sane reckoning, the conquest should have been impossible. But the kings of Westeros had never faced a dragon, and they did not understand, until it was far too late, what one could do. The first to learn was the Storm King, Argilac the Arrogant, last of the ancient line of Durrandon. He met Rhaenys and her dragon in the field, and his army broke, and he died, and his great seat of Storm's End passed to the Targaryens. But the lesson that truly taught Westeros what it faced came at Harrenhal. Harren the Black, king of the Iron Islands and the rivers, had just finished the largest castle ever built in Westeros, a monstrous pile of stone with walls so thick and towers so high, he believed no force on earth could take it. Aegon did not try to take it. He flew Balerion over the walls and set the castle on fire from above. Stone does not burn, but the men inside it do, and the wood and the cloth and the flesh within those mighty towers turned to ash in a single night. Harren and all his sons died in the inferno. The proudest castle in the world became a blackened ruin in an evening, and every lord in Westeros understood at last that walls meant nothing now. The greatest battle of the war came in the Reach. There the 2 most powerful kings remaining, Mern of House Gardner and Loren of House Lannister, joined their armies together to crush the invader, once and for all. They brought the largest host Westeros had ever seen, tens of thousands of men, and they met Aegon in open country, and Aegon brought all 3 dragons at once. Visenya and Rhaenys flew at his side, and the 3 of them turned that golden field into a sea of fire. It was the only time in the entire conquest that all 3 dragons fought together, and the result was a slaughter so terrible the place was remembered ever after as the Field of Fire. Thousands of men burned. King Mern died, and with him died the line of House Gardner. The old kings of the Reach ended in a single afternoon. King Loren of the Rock saw what was happening, and fled, and lived, and later bent the knee. The Lannisters kept Casterly Rock by surrendering it. One by one, the kings submitted. The lords of the Riverlands had already turned on Harren, and declared for Aegon before Harrenhal burned. The Vale fell to Visenya without a battle, when she flew her dragon to the Eyrie, and the boy kings, with mother, chose to keep her son alive rather than test the flames. Dorne, the Reach, the Rock, the Stormlands, the rivers, the Vale, the islands, realm after realm gave way, until only one king of any size was left standing, and he was in the north.
That king was Torrhen Stark. He gathered the strength of the north and marched south, 30,000 men, and crossed the river to face Aegon's army on the open ground beyond. But Torrhen was not a fool, and he was not Argilac or Mern. He sat in his camp across the river and looked at what waited for him. 3 dragons and an army that had burned every other king in Westeros, and he did the arithmetic that the others had refused to do. He could fight, and his men would die, and the north would burn, and at the end of it, he would still lose. Or he could kneel. He spent the night in council, and some say his own bastard brother urged him to charge and die a king. That morning, Torrhen Stark crossed the river, set his crown on the ground, and bent the knee. He gave up a kingdom his family had held for thousands of years, rather than watch it burn, and for that, the songs called him the king who knelt, half in scorn and half in something like respect. He kept the north, kept Winterfell, kept his people alive. He simply held it now, as a lord, not a king. Only Dorne refused. The Dornish did not meet the dragons in open battle, because they had watched what happened to those who did. Instead, they emptied their castles, scattered into their deserts and mountains, and let the Targaryens burn empty halls and march into empty towns. There was nothing to conquer, only a country that would not stand still long enough to be beaten. Aegon would try for years and never break them. And in the end, Dorne remained the one piece of Westeros his conquest could not take. Dorne stayed independent for nearly 200 more years, but 6 of the 7 kingdoms had bent the knee, and that was enough.
For the first time in its entire history, the whole of Westeros, from the Wall to the mountains of Dorne, answered to a single ruler. Aegon was crowned, and he ordered the swords of all the kings and lords who had surrendered to him to be gathered up, 1,000 blades and more, the steel of every enemy he had beaten. He had them carried to King's Landing, and there, with the fire of Balerion, he melted and twisted and fused them into a single monstrous chair. It was ugly and jagged and uncomfortable, a tangle of blades that could cut a careless king who sat it wrong, and that was the point. He called it the Iron Throne, and he meant it to remind every man who looked at it that it was built from the weapons of the defeated.
The realm he made was held together by fear of fire and nothing else, and the throne he forged from his enemies' swords was a perfect symbol of the thing he had built. A seat of power assembled from the broken weapons of everyone who had lost. Westeros was one kingdom now. It had been made one by force, and force was the only thing holding it together. Aegon ruled for decades, and when he died of old age in his bed, the realm he had welded together by fire had not yet been tested. He had held it by the simple fact of his dragons and the memory of what they had done. The question no one had answered was whether the kingdom could survive a king who was not Aegon. The answer came quickly, and it was not a kind one. The crown passed to his eldest son, Aenys. He was a gentleman, thoughtful and well-meaning, and in a settled country, he might have made a decent ruler. But Westeros was not settled. It was 40 years removed from being 7 separate kingdoms, and the lords who had bent the knee remembered when they had not. They smelled weakness in a soft king, and within months of his crowning, rebellions broke out across the realm. Aenys put them down, but slowly and without conviction, and every hesitation taught the realm that the dragon could be defied. The deeper danger was not the rebel lords. It was the faith.
When the Andals had come to Westeros thousands of years before, they had brought the worship of the Seven, and that religion had grown into the largest and most powerful institution in the south. The High Septon in Old Town commanded the devotion of millions, and the faith had 2 military orders, armed and devoted men sworn to defend it. One was the warriors' sons, knights who wore a 7-pointed star on their shields, and were called the Stars. The other was the poor fellows, a vast rabble of common men who carried axes and clubs and were called the Swords. Together they could field tens of thousands, and they had never made their peace with their dragon kings.
What they could not forgive was the Targaryen custom of marrying brother to sister. To the faith, this was incest, an abomination, a sin against the gods. The High Septon eventually denounced the king from the steps of the Great Sept, and across the realm, the stars and the swords took up arms. The king, frightened and sick, fled to Dragonstone, and there he died, worn down by the storm he could not control. Some whispered he had been poisoned. Whether or not that was true, the gentle king was dead, and the throne stood empty in the middle of a holy war. Into that emptiness stepped his half-brother, Maegor. He was the only son of Aegon's warrior queen, Visenya, and he was everything his brother had not been.
He was a giant of a man, a fearsome warrior, and he rode the dragon Valerian now, the same black dread that had burned Harrenhal. He had been exiled by his brother for taking a second wife. But the moment the throne came open, he returned, and Visenya crowned him with Aegon's own crown. He did not wait for the proper heir, his nephew, to come of age. He simply took the throne, and he took it meaning to answer the faith not with words, but with fire. On a scale Westeros had not seen since the conquest. It'Sanoso Manet, Westeros, had not seen since the conquest itself. The warriors' sons held a great fortified sept in Kingserne Landing, and Maegor had it destroyed, and the knights within put to death.
When a vast host of the poor fellows gathered against him, he met them in the field and slaughtered them thousands at a time, riding Balerion over their ranks and burning them where they stood. He offered bounties for the heads of the faith militant, paying in gold and silver for the skulls of the men who had taken up arms against him. He did not try to win the faith over. He tried to exterminate it, and for a time it seemed he would. His cruelty did not stop at the faith. He grew suspicious of everyone, and the longer he ruled, the more blood he spilled. The most infamous of his crimes came with the building of the Red Keep, the great castle Aegon had begun above King's Landing.
Maegor finished it, and beneath it he ordered a maze of secret passages and hidden tunnels built into the stone. When the work was done, he had the men who built it killed, every mason and architect and laborer, so that no one living would know the secrets of his own castle. The men who raised the seat of his power were murdered for the crime of knowing how it was made. Westeros remembered him after that by a single name. They called him Maegor the Cruel, and the name has never left him. He took wife after wife, 6 in all, searching for an heir, and from none of them did he get a living child. His queens miscarried, or bore monsters, or died, and some of them died by his own hand or his suspicion.
He killed one nephew who might have challenged him, and when another nephew's claim grew strong, he found himself with fewer and fewer friends. The lords who had feared him began to weigh that fear against their hatred, and hatred was winning. The faith he had crushed was beaten but not loved, and the realm he ruled by terror had come to despise him utterly. A man who rules by fear must never let the fear fail, and Maegor's was beginning to fail. In the end, his reign lasted only 6 years, and it ended without a battle. The lords of the realm turned against him and declared for his young nephew, the rightful heir he had pushed aside. The army he summoned melted away, and one morning Maegor was found dead upon the Iron Throne itself, seated on the tangle of blades his father had forged, his wrists opened by the very seat he had killed so many to keep. Whether he took his own life, or whether the throne's blades were helped into his flesh by an enemy in the dark, no one ever proved. He died as he had ruled, alone and surrounded by people who wanted him gone. This is the lesson buried in Maegor's short and brutal reign, and it is the one the dynasty would spend 300 years half learning and forgetting. The Iron Throne could not be held by terror alone. Aegon had conquered by fire, but conquest and rule are not the same thing. And a king who answers every problem with butchery
only teaches the realm to wait for him to die. Maegor broke the armed power of the faith for good, and the warriors' sons and the poor fellows would not march again for centuries. But he broke it at the cost of every shred of love the crown might have earned, and he left the throne to his successor, soaked in blood and surrounded by enemies. He became the cautionary tale the Targaryens told themselves in the years that followed, the dragon who ruled by cruelty and died for it. The tragedy is that the family never truly took the lesson to heart. They would tell Maegor's story for generations, and more than once when the fire was in their blood, they would live it again. The nephew the lords had declared for was named Jaehaerys, and he was 14 years old when the throne came to him. He was the youngest son of the gentle Aenys, and he had spent his boyhood hiding from his uncle's suspicion, growing up in the shadow of a man who killed kin without hesitation. A child raised under that kind of fear might have grown into another Maegor. Instead, he grew into the opposite. The first thing he did was undo his uncle's war. The faith still nursed its wounds, and the crown still had its dragons, and another generation of fire and slaughter was entirely possible. Jaehaerys chose a different road. He sat down with the High Septon and made peace. The terms were a bargain that should not have worked, and did. The crown would lay down nothing of its power, but it would protect the faith and its followers under the law. In return, the faith would stop questioning how the Targaryens married, and it would formally pardon the Dragon Kings for everything Maegor had done. The two armed orders, the warriors' sons and the poor fellows, were disbanded for good rather than crushed again, and the men who had survived were quietly absorbed back into ordinary life. The holy war that had killed thousands simply ended, not with a victory, but with both sides agreeing they had bled enough. It was the same kind of settlement the children and the first men had reached on the Isle of Faces, in the dawn of the world, and it worked for the same reason. Neither side had to be destroyed. Each only had to stop. Jaehaerys understood something his uncle never had, that a king who must win every argument by killing the other man will eventually run out of subjects. Beside him through all of it stood his sister Alysanne, who was also his wife, and who became one of the most beloved figures in the history of the realm. She was clever, warm, and tireless, and where Jaehaerys ruled from the throne, Alysanne ruled from beside it. The small folk loved her in a way they had loved no Targaryen before. She flew her dragon across the kingdoms, and spoke with women and common people, whom kings never bothered to notice, and she carried what she learned back to her husband. More than one of his great reforms began as her idea. History would remember her as Good Queen Alysanne, and the name was honestly earned. Together, they gave Westeros something it had never had under a king, which was good government that lasted. Jaehaerys reigned for 55 years, longer than any Targaryen before or after him, and the realm grew rich and quiet under him. He earned 2 names of his own. Men called him the Conciliator, for the peace he made with the faith, and in his old age they called him simply the Old King, because so few people could remember a time before him. His works were the kind that do not burn. He took the tangled, contradictory laws of 7 once separate kingdoms and set his finest minds to making them one body of law for the whole realm. It was a single code that bound a lord in the north to the same justice as a lord in the Reach. He built roads, the great king's roads that ran the length of Westeros, north to the wall and south to the marches, were laid down in his reign, and they knit the continent together more tightly than any conquest had. Trade moved along them. Messages moved along them. For the first time, the 7 kingdoms began to feel less like 7 enemies forced into one bed, and more like one country. One reform mattered more than roads or law codes. Across much of Westeros, there had long lingered an old custom called the Lord's Right to the First Night, by which a lord could claim a common man's bride on her wedding night before her own husband. It was a cruelty, dressed up as tradition, and it had endured for centuries, because the powerful enjoyed it, and the powerless could not stop it. Alysanne heard of it from the women she spoke to, and she pressed her husband until he abolished it outright. The lords protested. The custom was theirs, they argued, and old. Jaehaerys ended it anyway. It was a small mercy in the grand sweep of a kingdom, and it told you everything about the difference between this reign and the one before it. Maegor's idea of kingship was to take,
Jaehaerys's was to protect. He and Alysanne made their great progresses through the kingdoms, traveling the realm in person so that the people might see their rulers and be heard by them. They were not distant figures on a far throne. They walked into the halls of their lords and the towns of their small folk, and the realm came to know them. A king who lets himself be seen and a queen who listens are worth more to a kingdom's peace than any number of dragons. And for 2 generations, Westeros had both. This is the truth that sits at the center of the old king's long reign, and it is the one that makes everything afterwards so much sadder. The Targaryens were not only a family of conquerors and tyrants. For 55 years, they showed that dragons could build as well as burn, that the same blood that produced Maegor could produce a king who gave Westeros law, roads, peace, and mercy. The Golden Age was real, the prosperity was real, and that is precisely why the ruin that came after was not something done to the Targaryens by an enemy. It was a wound they would open in themselves. For all his wisdom, Jaehaerys outlived his own future. He had many children with Alysanne, but death took them one by one, and the sons he had groomed to follow him died before he did. By the end of his long life, the line of succession had grown tangled, and the heir was no longer obvious. His chosen successor was his grandson, a gentle and bookish boy named Viserys. But Viserys was not the only claimant with Targaryen blood. The question of who should come after the old king could not be settled by simple custom. So near the end of his reign, the realm did something it had never done before. The lords of Westeros gathered in a great council, hundreds of them, to decide the succession by their own voices. The choice came down to 2 candidates, and one of them, by the older lines of blood, was a woman. The lords chose the man. They passed over the female claim and gave their support to Viserys.
And the principle they set down that day was that the Iron Throne should not pass to a woman, or through a woman's line, while a male claimant lived. They thought they were settling a question. They were planting one. Jaehaerys died not long after, full of years, mourned across the whole realm as the greatest king who had ever sat the throne. He left behind a kingdom richer and more united than the one he had inherited, and a peace that had lasted longer than any in living memory. He also left behind that council's decision, sitting quietly in the law like a seed in dry ground.
No one could see yet what it would grow into, but the Targaryens had just been taught by their own beloved old king that a crown could be handed from one man to another by the will of the lords. In time, 2 of his descendants would each insist the crown was theirs. The golden peace he spent 55 years building would burn in a single generation. The grandson the lords had chosen, Viserys, took the throne and ruled for 26 years, and they were good years. He was a generous, easygoing man who wanted nothing so much as to keep the peace his grandfather had built. He largely succeeded. The realm stayed rich. The dragons stayed numerous. No great war troubled his reign. But beneath the calm, the seed the great council had planted was already pushing roots into the dark, and Viserys, for all his kindness, watered it himself. Early in his reign, he named his heir, and the choice was unusual. His firstborn was a daughter, Rhaenyra, and he loved her above all others. He declared her his successor, had the lords of the realm swear their oath to her, and seated her beside him as the heir to the Iron Throne. Hundreds of the most powerful men in Westeros knelt and promised to honor her claim. It was a direct contradiction of the principle the Great Council had set down only a few years before, and it sat uneasily with many of those same lords. But Viserys was king, and they swore.
Then his first wife died, and he married again. His second wife was Alicent, of House Hightower, clever and ambitious, and she gave him sons. The eldest was named Aegon. From the day that boy was born, the realm held 2 answers to a single question, and they could not both be true. By his father's decree, The heir was Rhaenyra, the daughter. By the older custom and the great council's ruling, the heir should be Aegon, the true-born son. Viserys never wavered. He kept Rhaenyra as his heir to the end of his life, but he never forced the matter to a reckoning either, and so the question simply waited, growing more dangerous with every year that passed. On one side gathered those who supported Queen Alicent and her son Aegon, and because the Queen favoured green at a great tournament, they came to be called the Greens. On the other side stood those loyal to Princess Rhaenyra, who wore black, and they were called the Blacks. For years, the rivalry was a thing of whispers and slights, of cold looks across the hall, and quiet plotting in private chambers. The two women at its centre grew to hate each other. Their children grew up as rivals rather than kin. But the old king lived on, and while he lived, the peace held by the sheer weight of his presence. Everyone was waiting for him to die. When at last he did, the thing that had been coming for 30 years arrived all at once. Viserys passed quietly in his sleep, an old and weary man. The realm he left behind was the richest in its history, and the most heavily armed with dragons it would ever be. His body was not yet cold before the trap sprang shut. The Greens moved first, and they moved with terrible speed. The Queen and her allies on the small council had no intention of letting Rhaenyra take the throne her father had promised her. They closed the gates of the Red Keep. They kept the king's death secret from the city while they acted. They convened in private and resolved to crown Aegon at once, and they were prepared to kill any man who stood in their way. One member of the council, who argued for honoring the old oaths, was given a brutal choice, and the others fell into line. Within days they brought Aegon out before the people of King's Landing and set a crown upon his head, his father's crown, and proclaimed him Aegon, the second of his name. The small folk cheered a coronation they did not understand. Rhaenyra learned of it only afterward, far away on the island of Dragonstone, where she had been kept from court by her stepmothers, Sarv faction. The news reached her at the worst possible moment in the midst of a hard labour, and the shock of it brought on a stillbirth. She lost the child she was carrying. Then she rose from that bed and answered the Greens in the only way left to her. On Dragonstone, she summoned her own loyalists and was crowned in turn, queen in her own right, with the rightful claim her father had given her, and the oaths of half the realm to back it. Now there were two monarchs, each certain the other was a usurper. There was no longer any voice old enough or beloved enough to make them stop. The realms split down the middle, lord by lord and house by house. Some declared for the king in King's Landing, some for the queen on Dragonstone, and the choosing tore through families and regions alike. The reasons men gave were grand. They spoke of rightful succession, of sworn oaths, of law and custom, and the will of the dead king. The reasons that actually moved them were older and smaller. Some chose the side their rivals had not. Some chose where the marriages and grudges of generations pointed them. Some simply chose the claimant they thought would win. The great houses weighed their dragons, and their armies, and the leanings of their neighbors. And one by one, they committed themselves. And once committed, there was no easy way back. What made this war different from every war Westeros had known was the weapon at its heart. There were nearly 20 living dragons in the world, and almost all of them belonged to one family. The Greens had dragons. The Blacks had dragons. For the first time in history, both sides of a conflict could answer fire with fire. The thing that had made the Targaryens untouchable, the thing that had let 3 of them conquer a continent and hold it for more than a century, was now turned inward, aimed at itself. Every advantage the dynasty had ever held over its subjects, it now held over its own blood. This is the truth that sits beneath the whole catastrophe. The Targaryens were never brought down by Westeros. No Stark army, no Andal rising, no foreign enemy across the sea ever came close to ending them. The thing that broke them was the thing they had carried inside the family from the beginning, the question of who should rule when more than one of them could. The Dance of the Dragons did not begin on a battlefield. It began in a sick room, over a crown lifted from a dead man's brow before the realm even knew he was gone. and in a council that chose to seize the throne rather than share it. The first blood of the war was shed in palace corridors, in secret rooms, by people who knew one another's names. For a few uneasy weeks, the two crowns simply glared at each other across the water, each sending out ravens, each calling in its banners, each hoping the other might yet be talked down or frightened into yielding. Neither would. Too much had been done that could not be undone. A king had been crowned in stolen haste. A queen had buried a child and answered with a crown of her own, and the lords of the realm had drawn their lines. All that remained was for someone to strike the first true blow and turn a war of words and proclamations into a war of fire. It would not be long in coming, and when it came, it would come on dragonback. And nothing about Westeros would ever be the same. The first blow fell at Storm's End, and it fell almost by accident. Rhaenyra sent her young son Lucerys there on dragonback, a boy on a half-grown mount, carrying a Rhaenyra message meant to win the great house of the Stormlands to her cause. He arrived to find that the Greens had reached the castle before him, and that his uncle Aemond was Crestor's already there, an older man on a far larger and more terrible dragon. What words passed between them inside the walls hardly mattered. The boy was sent away unharmed by the law of guest right and the orders of the lord of the castle. But once the two of them were aloft in a gathering storm, the older dragon and its rider gave chase. The great beast ran the smaller one down over the cliffs, and Lucerys and his mount were torn from the sky and swallowed by the sea. That was the moment the war stopped being a quarrel between councils and became a thing of blood and grief. When word reached Rhaenyra that her son was dead, something in her hardened past any hope of peace. Her answer was swift and merciless. Within days, agents in the pay of her party found their way into the Red Keep itself, and one of King Aegon's own small children was murdered in revenge. A death meant to answer a death. A boy for a boy. From that point forward, neither side spoke seriously of reconciliation. The killing had become personal, passed back and forth between cousins and uncles and children, and once it ran in that channel, it could not be turned aside. What followed was nearly 2 years of war, fought on a scale Westeros had never seen, and would never see again. Armies marched and burned, and starved in the field, as armies always had, but above them flew the dragons, and that was the horror that set this war apart from all the others. Both sides could now meet fire with fire, and so they did. The Blacks held the greater number of dragons and dragon riders at the start, and they used that advantage to seize King's Landing itself, driving the Greens out and setting Rhaenyra upon the Iron Throne she had been promised. For a brief while, it seemed she had won, but dragons did not make their riders safe. They made them targets. The greatest single clash of the war came over the God's Eye, the vast lake at the heart of the realm, near the ruins of Harrenhal. There, 2 dragons and their riders met in the open sky and fought to the death high above the water. The people who watched from below saw the beasts locked together, tearing at each other as they fell, until both plunged burning into the lake and were gone. 2 dragons and 2 riders, destroyed in a single afternoon. Then neither side could truly call it a victory. This was the new arithmetic of the war. Every battle in the sky cost the family the very thing that made it powerful, and there was no way to replace what was spent. Dragons could not be forged like swords or raised like levies. When one died, it was simply gone. As the dragons killed one another in the air, the realm beneath them came apart. The fighting bred famine. Trade collapsed. Fields went unsown, and the great city of King's Landing swelled with refugees and emptied of food. The small folk had cheered a coronation they did not understand, and now they were the ones who starved and died for a quarrel between people they would never meet. Their fear and hunger curdled into rage, and that rage found a target. A rumor spread through the streets that the dragons themselves were to blame for the ruin of the dream world. And one terrible night, the mob of King's Landing rose and stormed the dragon pit, the great domed hall where several of the beasts were kept chained. Thousands of common men and women threw themselves against dragons in the dark.
The dragons killed them by the hundreds. But there were always more people than there were dragons. And when the night was over, several of the most powerful beasts in the world lay dead, butchered by an unarmed crowd. The Targaryens had spent centuries teaching Westeros to fear their fire. That night, the small folk learned that fire could be drowned in enough bodies. By then, the war had become a thing that fed on its own makers. Rhaenyra, who had taken the throne, found the city turning against her, her treasury empty, her dragons dying one by one. She was driven from King's Landing in the end, hunted and betrayed, and she came at last into the hands of her own half-brother, the king she had spent 2 years fighting. Aegon II had her put to death in a manner meant to be a final humiliation before the eyes of her surviving son. So died the queen her father had named, the woman around whom half the realm had rallied, killed not by a foreign enemy, but by her own brother over a chair their grandfather had built, and it did not save him. Aegon himself was a broken man by then, his body ruined in an earlier fall from Dragonback, ruling a realm that was ash and grief in every direction. He outlived his sister by only a few months. In the end, he too was murdered quietly by men who had decided the war could not stop while he drew breath. Poison, most accounts agree, given by those close enough to do it. Both monarchs were dead. The king who had been crowned in stolen haste, and the queen who had answered with a crown of her own, had each destroyed the other, and between them they had destroyed almost everything they were fighting to possess. When the smoke cleared and a child was lifted onto the throne to end the war, the count of the dead was beyond reckoning. Tens of thousands had perished in the field, and in the burning towns, and in the starving streets. Whole branches of the royal family had been wiped out, parents and children alike. But the deepest wound of all was not counted in human lives. At the start of the dance, there had been nearly 20 living dragons in the world, the greatest concentration of them since the fall of Valyria. When it ended, only a handful remained, and those few were sickly, half-grown or scarred past flying. The thing that had made the Targaryens the masters of Westeros was all but gone, and they had not lost it to any enemy. They had thrown it away on themselves. This is the truth that gives the dance its weight. The Targaryen magic did not fade slowly across the centuries, the way old powers usually do. It died here in less than 2 years, burned out of the sky by its own keepers. The dynasty had spent 130 years believing its fire made it untouchable. In the end, it proved exactly how untouchable that fire was, by turning it inward and finding that it burned them as readily as anyone else. After the dance, the Targaryens still sat the Iron Throne, but the wonder had gone out of them, and somewhere in the back of every lord's mind, a new and dangerous thought had taken root, that the dragons could die, and that the men who rode them were, after all, only men. The child lifted onto the throne to end the war was Aegon III, a boy who had watched his own mother devoured before his eyes. He grew into a silent, grim king who wanted nothing to do with the creatures that had ruined his family. Under his reign, the few surviving dragons dwindled and sickened, and the last of them died as a stunted, malformed thing, never larger than a dog, chained in a cellar far from the open sky. There are stories that men tried to breed more, that eggs were warmed and watched and prayed over, and that nothing ever hatched. Whatever the reason, the fire simply went out. The greatest weapon the world had ever known passed from the Targaryens, not in a battle, but in a long, quiet failure. And the king who presided over it was glad to see it go. What remained was a dynasty that looked the same from the outside and was hollow at the center. The Targaryens still had their silver hair, and their proud Valyrian names and their seat above every other house in Westeros. They still ruled, but the thing that had set them apart, the thing that had let 3 of them conquer a continent, was gone, and everyone knew it. For a few generations, this did not seem to matter very much. The realm was tired of war, and the Targaryens who followed governed it with varying skill and no great catastrophe. Some were able men,
Some were forgettable. The Iron Throne passed from father to son, and brother to brother, in the ordinary way that crowns pass, and the memory of dragons faded into something closer to legend than to living fear. Then came Aegon IV, and he undid in a single reign what cautious kings had spent a century rebuilding. History remembered him as Aegon the Unworthy, and the name was earned. He was a glutton and a lecher who took mistress after mistress and acknowledged a long line of bastard children, lavishing honors and lands and even Valyrian steel swords upon them, while neglecting the realm and resenting his own true-born heir. He was vain, cruel, and ruinously self-indulgent, and a kingdom that had survived starving mobs and burning skies now found itself slowly poisoned by the appetites of one fat man on a chair. His final act was the most damaging of all. On his deathbed, Aegon IV declared all of his bastards legitimate, every one of them, at a single stroke. It was an act of spite and sentiment with no thought for what would follow, and what followed was a wound that bled for the better part of 100 years. Among those bastards was a young man named Daemon, the king's favorite, a gifted warrior, to whom Aegon had given the ancestral Targaryen sword, Blackfire, the very blade Aegon the Conqueror had carried. From that sword, the boy took his house name, legitimized, armed with the Conqueror's own steel, and convinced that a bastard who looked every inch a dragon had more right to rule than the true-born king who did not. Daemon Blackfire became the seed of everything that came after. The true-born king was Daeron II, a thoughtful and scholarly ruler, and by most measures a good one. He brought dawn into the realm at last through marriage and diplomacy, finishing peacefully the one conquest the dragons had never managed by force. But the very things that made him a wise king made him an easy target for resentment. Men who loved war called him weak. Men who had prospered under his reckless father felt slighted under his careful son. And around Daemon Blackfire there gathered all the discontent of the realm, the proud lords and ambitious knights who wanted a warrior on the throne instead of a reader, until that discontent hardened into open rebellion. The first Blackfire rebellion broke over Westeros and came to its head at a place called the Red Grass Field, in a battle that became legend in its own right. There, the two halves of the dragon's blood met in the open, trueborn against bastard, brother against half-brother, and the fighting was savage beyond anything since the dance. Daemon Blackfire fought at the heart of it, and very nearly won the day by sheer force of arms. What undid him was the bow. His half-brother, Brynden Rivers, another of old Aegon's legitimized bastards, but loyal to the true-born king, commanded a company of archers and broke the rebel center with a storm of arrows. Daemon was killed on the field, and his twin sons with him, and the first rising was drowned in its own blood. But a claimant's death is not the death of a cause. Daemon's younger half-brother, Aegor Rivers, called Bittersteel, survived the Redgrass Field and fled across the narrow sea, carrying with him the surviving Blackfire sons and a hatred that would never cool. In exile, he founded a company of sellswords called the Golden Company, made up of Westerosi exiles and the dispossessed, and he bound them to a single purpose: to keep the Blackfire claim alive and one day carry it back across the sea by force. He swore that the bones of the companies, dead, would be carried home only when the Blackfires sat the Iron Throne. For generations that company waited and trained and schemed in the free cities, the disciplined sword of a lost cause. And again it tried, for the claim did not die with one man or one battle. Across the long reigns that followed, the Blackfires came back rebellion after rebellion, each one launched by sons or grandsons of the original pretender, each one beaten down at a terrible cost. There were 5 risings in all before the line was finally extinguished. Plots and invasions and battles spread across the better part of a century. Every one of them was fought over the same question of whether the legitimized bastard line, or The Trueborn line held the better right. The great houses of Westeros were dragged into the quarrel again and again, forced to choose a side and bleed for it. The shadow of that deathbed legitimization fell across the lives of men who had not yet been born, when Aegon IV spoke the words.
And this is the plain truth. The Blackfire Wars laid bare. Once the dragons were gone, the Targaryens were no longer something apart from the rest of Westeros. They were simply another family, with the same divided loyalties and bastard grievances, and from disputed inheritances that had set lesser houses at one another's throats since the dawn of the realm. The thing that had made them untouchable had died in a cellar, and what was left was blood and ambition and a chair that too many men believed they had a right to sit. The conquerors who had once flown above every army in the world now fought their wars the way the Starks and the Lannisters and the Durandons always had, with steel and treachery and the bodies of common men. And they kept proving it, generation after generation, for 100 years. Through all of it, one figure threaded the long unraveling. Brynden Rivers, the archer who had broken the first rebellion, served crown after crown as soldier and spymaster, a pale, sinister man with a red birthmark across his face and a single eye, feared throughout the realm for the secrets he seemed to gather out of the very air. In time, he too would pass beyond the world of ordinary men. But before any of that, the throne he had defended so ruthlessly would pass at last to a line that ran toward a different kind of ruin, toward a king whose madness would finish what the Blackfires had only begun. The king who inherited that long unraveling was Aerys, the second of his name, and in his beginning there was nothing to mark him for ruin. He came to the throne young, handsome, and quick of wit, full of grand ambitions for the realm. He spoke of building great wonders, of conquering new lands across the sea, of leaving a name that men would remember beside the conqueror's own. The lords looked at him and saw promise. For a time, the realm even seemed to flourish, and much of the credit belonged not to the king, but to the man he raised up beside him. That man was Tywin Lannister, the hard and brilliant lord of Casterly Rock, whom Aerys named Hand of the King when both of them were still young. For nearly 20 years, Tywin governed the realm in all but name, and he governed it well. Order held, the treasury filled, the harvest came in, and lords who had grown unruly were brought sharply to heel. But the friendship that had begun in their youth slowly curdled. Aerys grew jealous of a Hand who was more respected than the king himself, and he took to undercutting Tywin in small, spiteful ways, overruling his judgments and mocking him before the court. The most able partnership the throne had known in generations rotted from within, poisoned by the king's swelling vanity. What turned that vanity into something far darker was a single act of folly and the captivity that followed. A minor lord of Duskendale, defying a royal command, seized the king and held him prisoner within his walls. For half a year, Aerys remained a captive, certain with every passing day that he would be murdered, while Tywin gathered an army outside, and the realm held its breath. In the end, a single brave knight of the king's guard slipped into the town and freed the king, and Duskendale was made to pay. But the man who came out of that captivity was not the man who had gone in. The defiance of Duskendale broke something in Aerys that never healed. He emerged frightened, suspicious, and consumed by a hatred of any blade that came near him, and from that fear his madness grew like rot through old wood. The years that followed darkened steadily. The king let his hair and his nails grow long, for he would not allow a razor in his presence. He saw treason in every whispered word, and plotters in every corner of his own keep, and he discovered, in his terror and his cruelty, a single obscene comfort. He came to love fire. Men accused before him were given to the flames, and the king watched them burn, and was soothed by it, telling himself that fire cleansed, that fire could not lie, that fire was the truest judgment of all. The whispered name spread through the realm, and stuck to him for all time. They called him the Mad King, and in the cellars beneath the Red Keep,
His pyromancers brewed jar after jar of wildfire at his command, a green substance that burned hotter than any natural flame, until the city itself sat upon a hidden lake of it. Against this descent stood the king's own son and heir. Rhaegar, the crown prince, was everything his father was not, thoughtful and melancholy, beloved by the common people and respected by the lords, a gifted warrior who would rather have been a singer. Many looked at Rhaegar and saw the realm's salvation, the strong and gentle king who would undo the damage of the father once the old man was gone. The court began quietly to wait for that day. And then, at a great tournament, the prince did a thing that would set the whole kingdom alight. The tourney was held at Harrenhal, the vast ruined castle the first dragon had burned, and it drew the greatest lords and knights of the realm beneath one roof. There were old grievances in that gathering, and quiet talk of what might be done about a mad king. But what men remembered afterward was none of that. They remembered that Rhaegar Targaryen, victorious in the lists and already wed to a Dornish princess, took the crown of winter roses, meant for the queen of love and beauty. He laid it not in his wife's lap, but in the lap of a young northern girl named Lyanna Stark, who was promised to another man. In that single gesture, a silence fell over the hall, for everyone understood that something had shifted that could not be taken back. What truly happened between Rhaegar and Lyanna was never plainly known, and the realm has argued over it ever since. Some say the prince stole her away by force, others that she went with him willingly, that it was an elopement and not an abduction. What is certain is that Lyanna Stark vanished from the world in Rhaegar's wells company, and that her family did not believe for a moment that she had gone of her own choosing. Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End, and she was the sister of Brandon Stark, the hot-blooded heir to Winterfell. To the men of her house, this was not romance. It was the crown prince of the realm, carrying off a daughter of the north, and they would have blood for it. Brandon Stark rode for King's Landing in a fury, his companions at his back, and shouted at the gates of the Red Keep for Rhaegar to come out and die. It was the worst thing he could have done before a king who saw murderers in every shadow. Aerys seized Brandon and his companions as traitors, and sent word to their fathers to come and answer for their sons. And here the Mad King made the choice that ended his dynasty. When Lord Rickard Stark came south to ransom his heir, the king did not hear him. He gave both father and son to the thing he loved. What was done in that hall was an obscenity dressed up as justice. Rickard Stark was bound and roasted alive in his own armor, while his son was slowly strangled before his eyes, struggling to reach a blade that would save his father and never reaching it. The two of them dying together for the king's amusement beneath a court too frightened to speak. It was not war. It was murder of a great lord and his heir under the guise of a trial by fire. And when it was done, Aerys was not finished. He sent to the Vale and demanded that Jon Arryn surrender to him the two young men fostered in his fire care, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, the brother and the betrothed of the stolen girl, so that they too could be put to death. That demand was the spark that burned down 300 years. Jon Arryn would not give up the boys he had raised as his own sons. Instead, he called his banners, and Robert and Eddard rode north and west to raise their own. And what had begun as one prince's reckless passion became a rebellion of half the realm. The dynasty that had ridden into Westeros on the backs of dragons, that had melted 1,000 swords into a throne, and ruled from it for 3 centuries, had at last done the one thing no crown can survive. It had turned its fire on its own great lords, and the great lords were coming to put that fire out for good. The rebellion that followed took its name from the man at its head, but it was held together by 4 houses and the bonds between them. Jon Arryn of the Vale had raised both Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, and he stood as the elder of the cause. Ned, now the Lord of Winterfell in his murdered father's place, brought the north. Robert brought the Stormlands, and a claim to the throne older than most men remembered, for there was Targaryen blood in the Baratheon line, and Hoster Tully of Riverrun bound himself to the rest by marriage, wedding his daughters to Jon Arryn and to Eddard Stark, so that the Vale, the north, and the riverlands rode as one. Half the realm rose, and half stood with the crown, and the killing began. The early fighting did not favor the rebels. Robert won battles in the Stormlands, but found himself cut off, hunted, forced to hide in a town called Stony Sept, while a royal army searched the houses for him street by street. He was found by a loyalist host before his friends could reach him, and for a few desperate hours, the rebellion nearly died there in the alleys, with its leader run to ground. Then Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully arrived, and the fighting spilled through the whole town. The bells of Stony Sept rang the alarm, as men killed one another in the streets. And when it was over, Robert had survived, and the royal host had been broken. The Battle of the Bells did more than save Robert's life. It convinced a wavering realm that the rebels might actually win. And it cost the king the loyalty of the very hand who had once made his reign great. For all through these months, the two most powerful houses in Westeros had not moved. Tywin Lannister sat in his rock and watched his army idle, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. And the Crown Prince Rhaegar, the cause of all of it, had ridden off into the south and vanished, leaving his father to fight a war the father had started. When at last Rhaegar returned and gathered the loyalist strength to him, the two armies came together at a ford on the Trident, the great river that ran through the heart of the realm. There the rebellion would be decided. The Battle of the Trident was the bloodiest fighting of the war. Thousands against thousands in the shallows and on the banks, and at the center of it, the two men whose quarrel had begun the whole thing finally met. Robert Baratheon, huge and furious, faced Rhaegar Targaryen in the running water, the rubies torn from the prince's armor, scattering into the current as they fought. Robert killed him. The crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms died in the river at the hands of the man whose betrothed he had stolen, and with him died the last real hope of the loyalist cause. The royal army broke. After the Trident, the war was effectively won, and all that remained was the taking of the capital. That grim task fell to the house that had waited longest. Tywin Lannister brought his army to the gates of Kings, landing at last and declared for the rebels. And the Mad King, trusting the father of his own hand, ordered the gates thrown open. It was the final folly of a ruined mind. The Lannister host poured into the city and sacked it, and what followed was not a battle, but a butchery. The capital given over to fire and plunder in the name of a cause that had not asked for it. Tywin meant to prove his loyalty to the winning side beyond all doubt, and he chose to prove it in the cruelest coin there was. In the chaos, his men sought out the royal family. The infant son and the young daughter of Rhaegar were killed where they were found. Small children murdered, so that no Targaryen heir might one day come seeking vengeance, and their bodies were wrapped in crimson cloaks and laid before Robert as a gift. It was a deed so cold that even the new king who profited from it could scarcely bear to look at it, and the shadow of those dead children would never wholly leave the men who allowed it. Within the Red Keep itself, the end came for the Mad King in a way no one had foreseen. Aerys, raving and afraid, gave a last command to his pyromancers to set the wildfire beneath the city alight, to burn King's Landing and every soul in it, rather than yield it. The man who stood nearest him was a knight of his own king's guard, Jaime Lannister, Tywin's golden son, sworn to defend the king with his life. Instead, Jaime killed him. He cut down the king he was bound to protect, to stop the burning of 500,000 people, and then sat down upon the empty Iron Throne to wait for whoever came next. He saved the city and damned his own name in the same stroke, and men would call him Kingslayer for the rest of his life, never asking why he had done it. So the dynasty fell. Robert Baratheon was crowned, and the throne forged, from 1,000 surrendered swords passed to a house that had won it the same way Aegon had, by force of arms, and the deaths of those who held it before. Ned Stark, riding south after the war's end, found his sister at last. Lyanna lay dying in a tower in the Mountains of Dawn, in a room the singers would call the Tower of Joy, and whatever passed between brother and sister in that room, she carried most of it to her grave. The girl whose vanishing had set the world on fire was buried in the cold crypts of Winterfell, beside the bones of her father and her brother, and the war that had been fought in her name was over. Not all the dragons were dead. Across the narrow sea, the last children of the Mad King had been carried to safety in the war's final days. A young prince named Viserys, and a sister born in storm and exile, the infant Daenerys. They grew up in foreign cities with nothing but a name and a grievance, dreaming of a throne they had never seen. While in Westeros, men slowly forgot they existed. The realm told itself the Targaryens were finished. It was wrong, and so the long history of Westeros arrived. After 10,000 years, at the very place it had started, a conqueror sat a throne that had belonged to someone else, lifted there by the slaughter of the family before him. An old order had been swept away, and a new one raised on its bones, exactly as the children had been swept aside by the first men by the Andals, and every king of every age by the king who came after. The men who built this new peace believed they had ended something. In truth, they had only turned the wheel one notch further and called the motion an ending. The exiled children were growing up hungry across the sea. The seeds of the next war were already planted in every grave that war had dug, and the oldest enemy of all still waited in the cold. In the one place no one was looking. But that is the story that everyone knows. Let us now reflect on what we have witnessed here today, for although the past may seem clear, it is in fact clouded in the fog of inaccuracy that thousands of years tends to create. The deeper you go into the past of Westeros, the less anyone actually knows. The recent centuries are written down in good order. Kings and their reigns, battles with dates, the births and deaths of lords. But go back far enough, and the writing thins out, then stops altogether. Before there were maesters with their chains and their record books, there was no one keeping count. There were only runes carved on stone, songs passed from one singer to the next, and the carved faces of the weirwood trees which keep their secrets. The men who later tried to measure that lost time could only guess. They speak of events 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, but they are not measuring, they are estimating, and they know it. Some of the wisest among them admit that the true span might be half that the years were stacked too high by singers who wanted their heroes to be older and grander than they were. A line of kings that ran for 2,000 years may have run for 800. A war that the songs say lasted a generation may have lasted a single hard winter. The numbers swell the further back they reach, because no one was alive to correct them. So the oldest history of Westeros is not really history at all. It is legend wearing the clothes of fact. The long night, the age of heroes, the first kings, and the first wars. These come down to us as stories first, and only later were they written into books, as though they were certain. A maester might record that a hero raised a castle 8,000 years ago, but he is only writing down what the singers sang, and the singers only sang what was sung to them, back and back, through more mouths than anyone can count. Every retelling smoothed an edge here and sharpened one there. This is the first thing to hold on to across this entire story. The further back you go, the more you are listening not to what happened, but to what people needed to have happened. Consider who survived to tell these tales, and who did not. The children of the forest left no written histories that men can read. The first men carved runes, but those who could read them are long dead. The accounts that come down to us were written in the end by the descendants of the winners, by the houses that held their lands, by the faith that held its temples, by the kings whose lines did not die out. A conquered people does not get to write the story of its conquest. A house that was destroyed does not get to explain itself. What we are left with is the version told by those still standing when the dust settled, and the version told by the victorious is always a little kinder to the victor. That is the first riddle of Westeros's age, and it never goes away. Did the children break the land with magic? Or did the sea simply rise and drown a strip of low ground, and the men who came after invent a war to explain it?
Did a hero truly walk into the heart of winter and bring back the dawn? Or did a long, cruel cold simply end the way all winters end, and the survivors needed a name to give their endurance? Every great event in the deep past has a clean, heroic shape to it, and clean, heroic shapes are exactly what frightened people build out of confusion when they tell the story afterward. None of this means the stories are false. Something raised the wall. Something carved the faces into the trees. Real events lie underneath all of it, heavy and certain, like stones beneath deep water. We simply cannot always see their true shape through the centuries of song laid over them.
So, the history of Westeros must be told the way it has come down, as the people of Westeros believed it, with the understanding that belief and fact are braided together so tightly that no one can fully pull them apart. When the tale says the children shattered a land bridge, that is what the men of Westeros held to be true, and what they held to be true shaped everything they did next. A legend that everyone believes does the work of a fact. It starts wars. It justifies thrones. It tells a man who his enemies are and who his ancestors were. And that is the deeper truth beneath all the uncertain dates. The history of Westeros was written by the victors and the survivors, which means every supposed fact about its oldest ages is really a story that someone at some point needed to be true. The land remembers nothing. Only the people remember. And the people remember what serves them. The tree on the island keeps its silence through all of it. It saw what truly happened. It will never say. So it is worth standing back at the end and looking at the whole of it, the way one looks at a great river, only from the height of a mountain, where the bends and the floods become a single line of water moving toward the sea. 10,000 years, more or less, by the counting of maesters, who do not entirely trust their own counting.
And across all of it, one motion repeats so often that it stops looking like accident and starts looking like law. A people holds the land, another people comes with sharper weapons or stranger gods, or both, and takes it. The old holders are killed, or driven to the margins, or absorbed until their grandchildren forget they were ever conquered at all. And the new holders, secure in their victory, tell themselves that the taking is finished now, that history has reached its proper and final shape, with them standing on top of it. Then someone sharper comes, and it begins again. The children of the forest were first, as far as anyone knows.
They did not conquer the land so much as live inside it, carving faces into the weirwoods, and asking nothing of the world but to be left among the trees. Then the first men crossed the broken arm with bronze and horses, and the children fought them, and broke the very earth to stop them, and lost anyway. The first men took the open country, and made their peace, and called it the end. They built their barrows and their kingdoms and their legends, and for a few thousand years they believed the land was theirs by right and always would be. Then came the Andals out of the east with iron and the seven-pointed star, and they did to the first men what the first men had done to the children south of the neck.
They erased an entire way of living, cut down the last weirwoods, hunted the children to nothing, and raised 7 kingdoms on the ruins. And they too believed they were the last, that the world had found its final masters in them. The Rhoynar came after, fleeing a fire across the sea, and made dawn into something new. And last of all came the Valyrians, a single family on a single rock, holding the only weapon left in the world that mattered. Aegon Targaryen melted 1,000 swords into a chair, and sat down, and named himself the end of all the conquering. He was not the end. None of them were ever the end. That is the first thing the long history teaches, and it teaches it without mercy.
Every age of Westeros believed it was the final one. The first men thought it. The Andals thought it. The dragons most of all thought it with their 300 years and their melted throne, and their certainty that nothing born of men could ever unseat a house that rode the sky. and every one of them was simply a stage the wheel passed through on its way to the next. The Targaryens did not even fall to a foreign conqueror in the end. They fell the way they had risen, to fire and ambition. Except this time, the fire was their own, and the ambition was their own. They spent their dragons and their blood on each other, until there was nothing left but a mad old, quiet heart of it. And through all those thousands of years of conquest and counter-conquest, of houses rising and being flayed and rising again, of kings drowned and burned and thrown from the sky, the thing that should have frightened them most was the thing they steadily refused to remember. The others came once in the deepest dark of the long night, and very nearly ended every living thing in the world. Men and children fought side by side then, because the alternative was extinction, and together they drove the cold back beyond the edge of memory. And then, having survived the single greatest danger their world had ever faced, the people of Westeros did the most human thing imaginable. They forgot it. They turned it into a story for children, a tale to frighten the young on winter nights, and they got on with the far more interesting business of killing one another over crowns. They built the greatest structure the world has ever seen, a wall of ice 300 miles long, to guard against that danger. Then, across the centuries, they stopped believing in the danger and kept the wall mostly out of habit. The watching curdled into ritual. The men sent to hold it became criminals and cast-offs, and the wildlings on the far side, the free folk, kept telling the old stories that the South had laughed away. This is the whole quiet weight of it. For 10,000 years, the people of Westeros fought over who would rule a land that outlives every ruler, while the one enemy that could end them all slept in the cold, in the one direction nobody troubled to look. The land does not care who holds it. That is the thing the kings could never quite accept, the thing that makes the whole long, bloody chronicle feel less like a march and more like a circle. The weirwoods that stood when the children carved them are standing still on the Isle of Faces, and in the heart of Winterfell, older than every house that ever claimed them, their red faces wet as if weeping for things no living man remembers. The wall still stands. The crypts beneath Winterfell still hold their cold kings. The throne still bristles with its 1,000 swords. The land abides, and the people on it rise and grasp and fall, each generation certain that his struggles are the ones that finally matter. Robert Baratheon sat his stolen throne and believed the wars were over. The men who had fought beside him believed they had built a lasting peace. They were as wrong as every conqueror before them, because peace in Westeros has never been a destination, only the pause between one turning and the next. The exiled children were growing up hungry across the sea, nursing a name and a grievance into something that would one day come back wearing fire. The lords who had carved up the spoils were already beginning to mistrust one another, and far in the north, beyond the wall that no one quite believed in anymore, the cold that had been, driven back at the dawn of everything, was in its own slow and patient way beginning to stir. So the history of Westeros is not a line moving forward towards some better and final thing. It is a wheel, and it turns, and the people lashed to it spend their short lives convinced that the turning is progress, and that their moment at the top is the shape the world was always meant to take. The children believed it. The first men believed it. The Andals, the Rhoynar, the dragons, and the man who broke the dragons all believed it in their turn. Not one of them was the last. Not one of them ever learned that they were turning. That is the oldest truth the weirwoods know, standing where they have stood since before the first crown was forged. Kings are temporary. Conquest is temporary. Even dragons are temporary. Only the wheel goes on, and the cold that waits at the bottom of every winter, and the land itself, indifferent and abiding, ready to be fought over again by whoever comes next, certain as all the others were that this time at last the fighting is finished for good.